Saying nothing, Minister. The next item of business is a debate on motion number 4682 in the name of Aileen Campbell on permanence and adoption. Members who wish to take part in the debate should press the request to speak button now. I now call on Aileen Campbell to speak to and move the motion. Minister, you've got 14 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This is National Adoption Week, and it is the British Association of Adoption and Fostering's 15th annual campaign to raise awareness of the benefits that come with adoption. These benefits don't only improve the life chances of children, but also for adoptive parents themselves. This year's theme is Rule Yourself In, a call to encourage people to think of themselves as possible adopters, as opposed to ruling themselves out because they think, for example, that they may be too old, live in the wrong place, are single or have a partner of the same sex. It's a simple campaign to get folk to realise that they can make come true the dreams of children and young people who are in need of a family who love them. Parents are the biggest single influencer and the most important educator in a child's life. And we know that children who experience a secure and loving and nurturing home environment are far better able to withstand life's challenges and achieve their full potential. Getting it right for every child means that every child deserves that environment, regardless of their circumstances. Our challenge, therefore, is to seek to achieve that for the children who, for whatever reason, can't be looked after by their birth parents. This Parliament has consistently and correctly put aside party politics on this agenda. Together we have learned of the importance of the early years, of secure attachments, of the importance of play and touch, and the value of strong and plentiful relationships in developing the self-control, risk awareness and resilience to cope with setbacks that we all need to help us through life. This time a year ago, the then Minister, Angela Constance, my colleague, told Parliament about the commitment by the Government to improve the timescales and quality of decision-making for children looked after by local authorities. The report on care and permanence planning by the Scottish Children's Reporters Administration focused minds when it revealed the longest time it took for one child to be placed with an adoptive family was 10 years and 10 months, an unacceptable figure, but at the extreme end of the scale. In response, we stated our intention to do what we could to shorten the length of time it takes to find a permanent home for a child. We said we would do this in partnership with the Looked After Children's Strategic Implementation Group, LACSIG, and other partner organisations through a shift in care planning towards fewer placements for children, early permanence decisions for every child, and a system that puts the child at the very centre of service design and delivery. We were clear this was a long-term ambition and one that we need to get right. That means ensuring the pace of change is correct to avoid driving forward with a change process that unintentionally creates dangerous consequences for our most vulnerable children and young people. For today's debate, I want to outline the distance travelled since last year's National Adoption Week in terms of government activity and to allow us in Parliament to do our bit to raise awareness of adoption. Last year, LACSIG hit the ground running by identifying the need for better planning and decision-making for children in care. Through its Care Planning Hub, LACSIG coordinates the activities detailed in the Scottish Government's Care and Permanence Plan 2011, all of which are designed to support the agencies responsible for care planning. The Care and Permanence Plan seeks to build a system which is proactive, identifying and responding to the needs of children as early in their life as possible. It is a system which multiple agencies work together to support and sustain placements, reducing disruption and keeping placement moves to a minimum. There are many other organisations and professionals involved in making timely and considered placements for children. It's not just the domain of social workers. We rely on the Children's Hearing System and panel members, lawyers and sheriffs, court officers, health professionals and the many voluntary organisations who work with children. Therefore, to bring about the improvements we all want to see, a range of approaches will be required and will need everyone involved in this system to commit to that change. And I'd like to outline the progress so far on care and permanence planning. The Scottish Government-funded Centre of Excellence for Looked After Children, CELSIS, is now just over a year old. The Centre has a dedicated care and permanence team staffed by a range of experienced professionals from the social work, research and legal sectors. Their job is simple. They work closely with the individual local authorities and their partners to make improvements to the local decision-making systems. The team is focused on practical, on-the-ground change with both troubleshooting when things go wrong and, more importantly, supporting comprehensive redesign of the care system one area at a time. With all we know about what works about early intervention, concurrent planning and the need for speedy decisions, the team is uniquely placed to offer the sort of intensive system-wide support needed to bring all this together and to help transform the care experience for every child. And I'm pleased to report the team is already in place, working with 7 local authorities on a range of specific improvement projects. For example, the team has successfully engaged with a local authority on managing contact. The team have also concentrated their efforts on working with professionals such as social workers and their managers, panel members, etc., through focus groups. So that others can benefit from what is learned during each project, the team hold regular regional permanence events for practitioners and for leaders. 6 events have already taken place for professionals to meet from different regions and to help us focus efforts on what will really make a difference. We have listened carefully to the valuable and often very candid feedback from these events, and it's helping us to shape what we and the permanence team do next. The team have already identified really good examples of best practice and intend to hold practice exchange events to highlight and promote these. In addition, children's panel members, social workers, lawyers and voluntary organisation workers have told us what the guiding principles should be for policy and practice concerning our looked after children. That we should collectively have much more ambition for our looked after children and to always strive for permanence for older children, those with disabilities, in sibling groups or from minority ethnic communities. That we should intervene in a child's life at the right and earliest point, ensuring that what is offered to that child is the best support they can get to enable them to stay in their family when and if that is possible. That we need to work hard to provide the right support for our practitioners to help them make their often very difficult decisions confidently, and that we work to create a shared understanding of what putting a child at the centre of service design and delivery actually means for social workers, panel members and the judiciary. But perhaps the most consistent and overriding request is for strong leadership at all levels of public life and across the wider corporate family. Since coming to this post nearly a year ago, I have taken my responsibility as a corporate parent very seriously. And in this chamber, we are all corporate parents and have, not least within this debate today, an opportunity to provide national leadership from Scotland's Parliament to ensure we do things better for our looked after children. And I hope many people across the chamber take the opportunity to engage with the corporate parenting training that's available next week. If we are going to achieve our ambition to make Scotland the best place in the world for a child to grow up, our children must feel loved and special in order to have a sense of trust and confidence in themselves. We know that secure attachments are necessary for a child to thrive, and that a child will do better at school and is likely to be good at making friends and subsequently form relationships later in life and cope with life's events. This is an essential component of our work on early years, and one of the biggest risks to the well-being of any child, especially our most vulnerable, is the impact of insecure attachments. After all, a poorly attached child becomes a poorly attached adult, and whose footprint on public services throughout their life will be large and will be expensive. Commissioned by LACSIG, it is timely, therefore, that Celsius will also shortly publish Scotland's first comprehensive study into how attachment theory is taught and used in practice to assess and plan the care of looked after children. We intend this to have a direct impact on practice across Scotland by sharing the lessons of projects such as the Geely Peace Club in Castlemilk, Change is a Must in Perth and Kinross, and CMAB School in Kinrossshire. We need to be in a position where every teacher, social worker and health professional understands attachment. Another part of our ambitious plan was the launch of Scotland's first National Adoption Register. We did that during Adoption Week last year in partnership with Bath. The register gives opportunities for children to be matched with families from across Scotland rather than just in their local area. So far, 19 local authorities and all 4 voluntary adoption agencies are referring children and approved adopters to the register, with referrals ideally not taking any longer than 3 months after a child's plan for adoption is agreed. Over the short life of the register so far, 135 children and 139 families have been referred to the linking service, and currently we have 82 children who have been linked to 47 families. 14 children have already been matched for adoption by the register, and that's 14 more than would otherwise have found a safe, stable, nurturing and permanent home. So whilst it's a modest start, it is nevertheless becoming an important tool to achieve early permanence for those referred to it. I would like all local authorities to use the register, and the Children and Young People's Bill proposes that referrals are a requirement by agencies for any child who has not found a home in 3 months. But there's still a need to do more to ensure that the approved families and children on the register are a match for each other. It's important to consider that children referred to the linking service find it much more difficult to find a family by virtue of their age or due to medical needs or developmental uncertainty, and some need to be placed with their siblings. These all present challenges to the chances of a child finding a permanent home. And that is why the work of the register has been expanded to help manage the expectations of prospective adopters and help them see the real child who can benefit from adoption. And I'm looking forward tomorrow to meeting some of the 75 families who attended Scotland's first 2 National Adoption Exchange Days at an event organised by Bath. These exchange days are events where prospective adopters are invited along to learn more about the children in their areas who could be adopted. And I understand that these events have been a real eye-opener for those taking part and who have valued the opportunity to speak directly with social workers and foster carers who know that child well. And I understand that there will be more of those to come. But the register can only do so much, and it can only support families already approved to adopt. If we are going to provide secure homes for more children, we badly need to find more adopters. The 2007 Adoption and Children Scotland Act introduced more opportunities to adopt, particularly for single people and same-sex couples. But we're not seeing significantly more people coming forward. A key aim is to spread the word to those people who may not see themselves as prospective adopters and encourage them to rule themselves in. The main criteria for people to adopt in Scotland is the ability to provide a safe, loving and nurturing home in which a child can flourish and maximise their future life chances. And I'd urge anyone who can offer such a home to contact their local authority or voluntary adoption agency this week, and for all of us here in the Chamber to do what we can to spread the messages across our constituencies. Yes?
Mayor MacArthur.
Intervention. That, along with the need to encourage new people to see themselves as potential adopters, there's a need to ensure that we rectify some of the problems in the system that are discouraging those who already put themselves forward either to adopt or to foster to remain in that position because they've been through experiences that just turn them off the whole process.
Minister.
Yeah, I take on board entirely what Liam MacArthur is saying. However, I think it was quite interesting hearing a call-in programme on radio where people needed to remind themselves that some of the questions, some of the processes are putting the child at the heart of that decision to make sure that that family is absolutely correct for that child to go to have a safe and nurturing home. So, whilst I understand entirely the point that Liam MacArthur is making, I always think we need to balance that up with ensuring that the child is at the centre of the policies and processes that we put in place. As part of what we outlined at this debate last year, we asked local authorities to submit their adoption service plans earlier this year. These outline how adoption services are planned and delivered and should evidence that every authority has a clear plan to raise the number of young people afforded a permanence or adoption, and 2 themes emerged. The adoption activity has increased over the last few years, and a number of local authorities are taking steps to improve permanence planning, and that Scotland as a whole could recruit more adoptive parents. A number of research studies have found that personal qualities such as emotional resilience and positive, realistic motivation are more likely to predict successful adoptive parenting than age or family structure. But despite this, many authorities have maintained age-based criteria with the upper age limit for adopters for young children, in some cases ranging between 40 and 45 years. And we also discovered a divergence in the way plans were prepared. And I'll be working to find the best and most constructive way to work with local authorities around achieving consistency whilst respecting local decisions making, as well as looking at delivery and improvement. I also know that some authorities are doing better than others, and I want to ensure that we learn from the best and support those authorities who need a bit more assistance. As I've already said, each and every one of us in this room is a corporate parent to over 16,000 children and young people looked after by our local authorities. Through no fault of their own, they find themselves in a position where their birth family could not care for them unsupported. These are Scotland's most vulnerable children, and they are the responsibility of us all. We should care for these children and have the same expectations for them as if they were our own. And I've had the pleasure of meeting many looked after children and young people. They are inspirational, resilient and articulate, and we should all be proud of them and what they can offer to our country. It's up to us to ensure that they can always realise that potential. I'm confident of the work that we are doing to take forward this agenda is moving in the right direction, and confident because of the work that we, LACSIG and Celsius, is doing. This work will also be enhanced by other areas of activity across government to help children and young people in Scotland. We've recently launched the National Parenting Strategy, and we've finished our consultation on the Children and Young People Bill. So I think we accept there is much to do and much more to achieve, but I think it's right that we take this opportunity to celebrate 15 years that BAF have been working to highlight adoption, and that we recognise the importance that adoptive parents and the potential adoptive parents have in realising and recognising positive outcomes for children in Scotland who need our care and our support. So thank you. I move the motion in my name.
Before Neil Bibby speaks, can I just say that we've got a wee bit of time in hand, so for members who are going to take interventions, we will compensate you with regards to time. I now call on Neil Bibby to speak to move amendment number 4682.1. Mr Bibby, you've got about 10 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Firstly, can I say I welcome this debate on adoption and permanence, and also say how appropriate it is to have this debate during National Adoption Week. It is vital that we use this opportunity to discuss how we can improve the adoptions process, improve the support that we give to our most vulnerable children, and improve the support we give to adoptive parents. We must look at ways of encouraging people to become adoptive parents, look at ways of sharing good practice and of supporting social workers, adoption panel members, children's hearing panel members and others in the important work they do. As corporate parents, all of us need to work together towards these aims and objectives. I hope and anticipate this will be a consensual and constructive debate, and can I say at the start, we support the Government's motion and our amendment is put forward as a constructive suggestion. We need to work together because we know the scale of the challenge facing us is stark. As the Minister has just said, we know that currently there are around 16,000 looked after children in Scotland, and this figure has been increasing every year since 2001 and is at its highest level since 1981. We also know that between 2010 and 2011 there's been a 2% increase in the number of children on child protection registers. In terms of placements, the number of children in residential care has remained fairly static over recent years, but there's an increasing number of children that are being looked after in community settings by foster carers, prospective adoptive parents and kinship carers. There is therefore a growing need to increase the number of parents willing to adopt, increase the number of foster carers and to improve the adoption process. We know that children thrive in stable and supportive environments, and permanence gives children long-term stability. As the Minister said, our policies must be child-centred and put their needs first. I therefore join the Minister in paying tribute to the work of the British Association for Adoption and Fostering in raising awareness of adoption and BAF's National Adoption Week, which is in its 15th year, and obviously the campaign of Rule Yourself In. I'm pleased that there will be a whole host of events and activities taking place right across the UK aimed at raising awareness about the rewards and challenges of adoption. I was pleased to see there are a number of events happening in Scotland, including Talk to Us About Adoption drop-in sessions, one of which will take place, I understand, at the St Enoch Shopping Centre in Glasgow on Thursday. I'm also pleased that Barnardo's Scotland is hosting adoption information evenings in Edinburgh, Glasgow and Aberdeen. This type of event is an ideal opportunity for people to go along, meet Barnardo's staff and find out a bit more about what adopting with Barnardo's is like. I hope and anticipate these information sessions will be well attended. I was also pleased to see that the campaign is using social media as a means of raising awareness and interacting with those interested in adopting. The National Adoption Week website encourages people to participate in the discussion by joining BAF's Chief Executive David Holmes on Wednesday from 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. for a Twitter question and answer session on adoption. This positive work should be welcomed because we do need to encourage more people to consider becoming adoptive parents and foster carers. I'm sure we all have had contact with parents who have adopted children. I know a number of parents myself who have done just that. I'm sure, like many others, they were frustrated at how long it took and frustrated at the processes they had to go through. But at the end of the day, they are delighted now to be supporting their child in a loving environment. Yes, sir.
Richard Lyle.
On the point you just made, how long it should take to adopt, how long do you think it should take? It took me 6 years.
Mr Bibby.
Well, 6 years is clearly very long indeed, and I think becoming a foster carer or adoptive parent is not easy, nor it should be. And candidates do need to go through long and rigorous assessments and sets of checks to ensure that children will be safe and nurtured. But I think, of course, we want to ensure the appropriate checks are in place, but we do need to establish permanency sooner rather than later. Lengthy delays in decision-making and establishing permanency are not only frustrating for adoptive parents, but can also be damaging and confusing for the child. We know this is easier said than done, because adoption plans can be contested, and sometimes there can be challenges in placing children until the final order is made. But we must listen to those parents and people working on the front line as to how we can address these issues. In terms of the Children and Young People Bill that the Minister mentioned, I welcome the move to ensure carers receive appropriate recognised training. However, we would caution the Government that any training should be at an appropriate level. Similarly, whilst we welcome the move to limit the number of children any foster carer can care for at one time, we cannot be so rigid in the application of this regulation that children from multi-sibling families need to be split up for no other reason than the family exceeds the regulatory number. The well-being of children must always be our prime concern. The Scottish Government's plan in the Children and Young People Bill to enshrine getting it right for every child in legislation and having a named person for each child is also welcome, as is seeking to improve the information sharing and planning in relation to individual children, and will help with the early intervention we need to see. Early intervention is crucial because we know that in July 2011 there were 80 unborn children on child protection registers. Previously, some local authorities did not place unborn children on child protection registers until the child was actually born. The revised national guidance now states that unborn children should be placed on child protection registers if this is required. This is a welcome step, and it is to be hoped that this will lead to children being placed in permanent care more quickly. Early intervention is also crucial because we know identifying adoptive parents for older children is a major challenge. It can be difficult to find them for boys over the age of 5, and it can be difficult to find them for girls over the age of 8. It's also difficult to find adoptive parents for children with special needs, and these children will often be the most damaged from their life experiences. It shouldn't be forgotten that even after a child is adopted or fostered, parents will often require ongoing support. There are good examples of such care, with Bernardo's providing a post-adoption support service, which I know a number of adoptive parents and foster carers have found very useful. Therefore, the Government's commitment in its national parent strategy to developing good practice in providing support to adoptive parents before and after a child is placed with them is, of course, one that we welcome. Sharing good practice, and the Minister mentioned this, is key and is one of the major themes in the very helpful briefing that Bernardo Scotland have provided for today's debate. They raise a number of very important points and suggestions. They raise concerns about inconsistency regarding what evidence is gathered by local authorities in the decision-making process. They also believe that local authorities and the Scottish Government must collect more robust data on this process, including the time taken to place the child and reasons for delay. And they point out concerns that there is currently no aggregated data or evidence routinely collected, which could help identify areas of good practice. I know the Minister will consider the points raised by Bernardo's carefully, as I'm sure we all appreciate that data collection is crucial to understanding the problems and helping to improve outcomes. Sharing good practice is also important because the recruitment of prospective adoptive parents is not always uniformly positive across Scotland. Some authorities do struggle to identify potential parents. Bernardo Scotland also make a very important point about support for social workers, which we want to raise today. As a son of 2 retired social workers, I probably should declare some sort of interest here. But there is no doubt that social workers do a very important job and are caring and dedicated professionals who do a very important job in what is often very challenging circumstances. Resources are important in this debate, and it is concerning to hear of social workers with increasing caseloads and the concerns raised about the pressures this places on them when trying to meet the needs of children and families. We must also aim to ensure that social workers are adequately supported and properly resourced, and we should thank social workers for all the work they do all year round that often goes unrecognised, along with thanking the hard work of adoption panel and children's hearing panel members. The problems that looked after children in the adoption process have been with us for many generations. Solving those problems will not be easy, but we must do whatever we can, because we know that if we can give children a stable, loving and supporting environment, they will thrive and they will flourish. We must do what we can to ensure children get the best possible start in life. We must do what we can to ensure children have a stable and supportive environment. We must do what we can to share good practice, and we must do what we can to support adoptive parents and people working on the front line. As corporate parents, we must do all that we can to help Scotland's most vulnerable children, and I move the amendment in my name.
I now call on Liam MacArthur to speak to and move amendment number 4682.2. Mr MacArthur, you've got about 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Like Neil Bibby, I too welcome this debate and this year's National Adoption Week. I think it's absolutely right that we join with others in attempting to raise awareness about the benefits of adoption for both children, but also, as Neil Bibby suggested, for adoptive parents as well. I think rule yourself in is a very appropriate theme for this year, given how often people, I think, simply don't see themselves in that particular role. I welcome the chance to discuss further the complex issue of improving Scotland's care and adoption services, as regrettably too many of Scotland's most vulnerable young people are still being denied the best start in life. And while the Government's motion is perhaps a little light in acknowledging these difficulties, I'm very grateful to the Minister for bringing forward this debate, and will be happy to support her motion later this afternoon. This is an issue, as the Minister acknowledged, that enjoys cross-party support, and I think it's also one that this Parliament has a reasonably good track record in covering over recent times. Members of the Education Committee reported earlier this year on its findings following an inquiry into educational attainment for looked-after children. Unsurprisingly, the need to improve the process of fostering and adoption in Scotland came out strongly during that inquiry, not least as critical factors in increasing permanency for some of our most vulnerable children and young people. On the back of that inquiry, and given the concerns that were raised with us by a very wide range of different organisations involved in the sector, the committee identified a clear need to look more specifically at the decision-making around whether children should be taken into care. This is currently underway, and I think it's absolutely right that as a committee we have made it a priority to ensure the voices and views of those directly affected, those looked after, who have been through or going through these processes, and those with experience of adoption are heard loud and clear. I'm grateful for all the insightful contributions that have been made to this work so far. And what is clear from this, and indeed all the evidence over recent years, is that we are collectively continuing to fail in our corporate parenting responsibilities. Attainment levels for looked-after children, particularly those looked after at home, remain far too low, and it's clear that the problems start at the earliest age, often prior to birth, as Neil Bibby acknowledged. Children first point to the years 0 to 3 as critical in terms of, quote, good attachments and child development. NSPCC appears to agree, highlighting the quote, significance of attachment and permanence for children, particularly in the early years, and providing a secure and protective foundation from which a child can grow and develop. What this demonstrates is that poor outcomes are not inevitable, and there are plenty of things that can and are being done across Scotland. I wish to join the Minister and Neil Bibby in putting on record my gratitude and admiration for all of the good work that is being done by very many individuals, agencies and organisations in this area. Many of the issues and situations they are confronted with day and daily are unimaginably difficult and sensitive. However, these are made no easier and too often are made worse by structures within which they are forced to operate. My amendment, which I'm happy to move, picks up on the points made by Bernardo Scotland in its briefing paper. Bernardo's believes that far too many children are waiting too long for a decision, enduring multiple short-term placements and developing complex needs as a result. All the evidence in this area shows that permanence is critical to a child's sense of well-being and security, and in turn to their life chances. Last year's SCRA report highlighted the many delays that still occur in the system, from the process of identifying children at risk right through to the point of adoption or other permanent solution. And this, as well as having the impact on the children, as I know from my experience of cases in Orkney, is also having an impact on the willingness of those who put themselves forward to foster and to adopt to remain in good faith with that process. I certainly not want to suggest that decisions in this area are ever easy or straightforward, and deciding to remove a child from the parent's care will never be taken lightly. But when it is so clear that delays in obtaining a permanent home are so deeply damaging for a child, and indeed when the research suggests that delays actually reduce the chances of permanence ever being achieved, it seems that the correct balance is still not being struck. Bernardo suggests a number of developments they'd like to see to improve decisions around permanency and adoption, including a national risk assessment framework to aid decision-making in all local authority areas in order to increase consistency across Scotland. There's still a great deal of inconsistency regarding how and what evidence is gathered to aid decision-making. Bernardo emphasises the need to ensure decisions are clear and based on objective evidence, and indeed that all evidence gathered is used to inform the process. I'm certainly no fan of a one-size-fits-all approach, but I certainly recognise the improved data collection on things like the time taken to place a child and reasons for delay could also help identify areas of good or indeed bad practice. Sadly, it is felt that all too often a lack of resources play a key part in decision-making, and so more expensive options are used as a last resort. However, I think the Minister was absolutely right to argue that the long-term costs to the individual child and to the wider community of leaving a child in a chaotic and damaging environment far outweigh the cost of that earlier intervention. This is another area where the Government must ensure that the widespread consensus around the importance of early intervention translates into sufficient resources and action. That said, I acknowledge there have been important developments recently and welcome the new parenting strategy and progress towards introducing the Rights of the Children and Young People's Bill. In particular, I welcome plans to recognise the role of kinship carers and efforts to increase use of Scotland's adoption register, although there have been concerns around confidentiality of information and which body is responsible for this at the various different stages. Scottish Liberal Democrats have also welcomed the proposal that the bill increase entitlement to preschool education. I pay tribute to the Minister for extending entitlement to looked after two-year-olds. I believe that early education has a vital role to play in tackling the attainment gap which persists in Scotland and which is responsible for the continuing cycle of poverty we see in too many communities. A child's development at 22 months can serve as an accurate predictor of educational outcomes at 26 years. And just last week, Save the Children published new research showing that children who grow up in poverty start primary school with development levels far behind those of their more affluent peers. That is why Scottish Liberal Democrats wish to work with Scottish ministers to extend preschool to more vulnerable two-year-olds. The UK Government is extending free early education to 40% of two-year-olds, focusing on children from poorer backgrounds. There is certainly cross-party consensus for the same approach to be taken forward in Scotland, and I urge the Minister to support those efforts so that two-year-olds in Scotland are not left behind in comparison to their counterparts south of the border. Deputy Presiding Officer, I congratulate the Government on bringing forward this debate on an issue where it is widely acknowledged that we still need to up our game. I look forward to the Education Committee contributing to helping deliver those improvements, and I hope this can be the lasting legacy of this Adoption Week, and I move the amendment in my name. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call on Nanette Millen. 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to be taking part in this debate on permanence and adoption during National Adoption Week, and to commend the work of the British Association of Adoption and Fostering in raising awareness of adoption to encourage more people to consider becoming adoptive parents. My husband and I became adoptive parents over 40 years ago, at a time when early adoption was quite common in a society which frowned on illegitimacy and did not encourage single parenting. We were desperately keen to become parents and approached adoption somewhat selfishly, I suppose, seeking the babies which nature didn't allow us to produce ourselves. And we were so fortunate because both our children came into our lives as tiny babies just weeks old. They went straight into foster care from the maternity hospital, were placed with us as soon as possible after the adoption papers were signed by their birth mothers at around 6 weeks. After a probationary period of about 3 months, our children became legally ours before they were 6 months old. We've never ever doubted that we made the right decision. Our lives were transformed, and we're eternally grateful to the birth parents who were brave enough to accept that adoption could give their babies a better start in life than they could offer at that time. I'm sure we're not perfect parents. I doubt if such a thing exists. But we have given our children love and security and the stability and discipline required to allow them to achieve their potential. And I'm delighted to say that they're now well-balanced, happy and successful adults, secure in the knowledge that we are still there to give help and advice when they want it, and we know that we can depend on them when we need their help. Certainly.
Nigel Dawn.
I'm grateful and delighted to hear the member's story, which I hadn't appreciated before. But I think Mel's just made an important point about discipline, which is something which I think we as parents know our children need. I do just wonder whether that's one of the problems of the corporate parent, that it is incredibly difficult for somebody other than the parent or an adopted parent, natural parent or an adopted parent, actually to provide the level of loving discipline, which is incredibly difficult to work out.
Nanette Milne.
I think that's a very good point, which I do agree with, because I think every child needs to know its limitations and what's right and what's wrong. Our children grew up in the knowledge that they were adopted, and both had 2 or 3 classmates who were in the same position, because at that time there were over 2,000 adoptions in Scotland every year. Contrast that with 2 years ago, when there were over 15,000 young people in care and less than 500 adoptions, an adoption rate of just 2.9%. The change in society between the 1970s and today happened quickly and dramatically, as it became the norm for single mums to keep their babies, as more and more marriages ended in divorce, and as a much freer society, a much freer lifestyle, led to substance and alcohol abuse among young people, many of whom found themselves unemployed and unable to give their offspring the safe, secure and stable environment they need to thrive. I was the medical advisor to Voluntary Services Aberdeen in the early 1980s, and by then the few children we were placing for adoption were older, and most were sometimes physically but particularly psychologically damaged by their early life experience. That situation has got worse, with the numbers of looked after children now overwhelming the resources of many of the councils responsible for them, and only a small number of these children are adopted. Last year, only 273 of them were living with prospective adopters, a figure which has changed little over 10 years. Since 2005, permanence orders have been available as an alternative to adoption, enabling stable long-term placements by giving the local authority the right to determine where a child will live until the age of 16, whilst the parents retain other parental rights and responsibilities on a shared basis with the local authority. But as Bernardo Scotland says in its briefing for the debate, far too many children are waiting too long for a decision on their future and endure multiple short-term placements, developing complex needs as a result. Bernardo's have a wish list of developments which they consider would improve decision-making on permanency and adoption, and to me these seem to be worthy aspirations and worthy of repetition, even though Neil Bibby and Liam MacArthur have already mentioned them in their speeches. A national risk assessment framework for decision-making to be used by local authorities considering removing a child from home would ensure consistency across Scotland, and decisions to do so should be evidence-based, which is not always the case at the present time. Bernardo's also stressed the need to collect more robust data on the decision-making process, which should include the time taken to place a child and the reasons for delay when this occurs. It seems strange to me that such data isn't routinely collected when it could be used to identify areas of good and bad practice. Most worryingly, Bernardo's believe that resource, rather than the best interests of the child, too often influences council decisions, and that children may be left in chaotic and damaging home conditions because to remove them, particularly into residential care, is too expensive, even though in the long run this will cost the public purse more and the children are likely to be irrevocably damaged. I don't think any of us would disagree that the focus must be on the child's well-being and what he or she needs to thrive and reach adulthood as someone who's achieved maximum potential in physical, education and emotional ability. So early intervention and planning with clearly stated timescales towards permanence are crucial to the child's likelihood of reaching this maximum potential. And it's been shown time and again that the younger the child when removed from an unsatisfactory home environment, the greater the chance that they will do better in later life, or do well in later life. So I do welcome the Government's commitment to multi-agency planning in pursuit of this aim. Unfortunately, there aren't enough foster carers at the present time to cope with the number of children who would benefit from living with a foster family, nor are there enough potential adopters yet identified to give these children the permanence they need and deserve. Hopefully, the National Adoption Register will move this forward, given the promising initial results. If the decision is made not to remove a child from the family setting, or if a child is returned home after a temporary removal, there's currently not enough family support available at times when it's most needed, such as weekends or out-of-office hours. Social workers do their best, but they are overworked, with caseloads that make it difficult to give proper support to families and children entrusted to their care. Local and central government need to ensure adequate resourcing of social work services for young people, because proper care at this time is likely to pay huge dividends as these children grow up in terms of their well-being and future contribution to society. Unfortunately, the number of children who become looked after has risen dramatically over the last few decades, and far too small a proportion of them go on to become adopted. But a culture shift towards giving more permanence to looked after children and towards encouraging adoption is now beginning to happen. And I do hope that the Scottish Government's recently launched parenting strategy, together with the forthcoming Rights of Children and Young People Scotland Bill, will result in many more children being able to grow up in the safe, secure, loving and stable environment which they deserve and to which they're entitled. Presiding Officer, I think this is likely to be a fairly consensual debate, and in that spirit, Scottish Conservatives will be happy to support the Government's motion and the Labour and Liberal Democrat amendments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now turn to the open debate, speeches of 6 minutes with a little bit of time at this point of the debate for interventions. I call Stuart Maxwell to be followed by Graham Pearson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Over the past year and a half, the Education Committee have undertaken a considerable amount of work on issues such as kinship care, the early years, and in particular the educational attainment of looked-after children. Now, during our in-depth inquiry on the latter, as Liam MacArthur mentioned, it was apparent that children categorised as looked after at home have the poorest educational outcomes, but the exam results of those looked after away from the parental home were around 10 times better. Now, this is a testament, I believe, to the good work done by all those working with these children. And decisions made early on in a child's life greatly affect outcomes. It's therefore imperative that these decisions are the right ones. Now, as a result of that inquiry, the committee agreed to focus on the decision-making processes involved in determining whether a child should be removed from their family home and taken into care, and crucially, to identify whether these decision-making processes are delivering the best outcome for children and their families. Now, as part of the inquiry launch, I met a group of foster carers at Barnardo's Fostering and Adoption Service in Edinburgh. Now, I believe it's important that we began our inquiry, as we intend to continue, by meeting people who not only know about the decision-making process, but who have direct experience of the results it produces. And I want to use the opportunity of this debate to cover some of the early and, I believe, relevant issues emerging from the early evidence. Now, we've already received evidence pointing to inconsistencies in decision-making, too great an emphasis being placed by decision-makers on the cost of care and delays in the system. Now, the committee is determined that this inquiry will hear from real people with direct experience of decision-making on whether to take children into care. That's foster carers, parents, social workers, staff in residential homes, children with experience of care, members of Child Protection committees and others. We've already received a large amount of written evidence and submissions in response to our call for evidence. Many complex issues were discussed in those submissions, and some of the evidence identified existing barriers to good quality early decision-making. Now, it was clear from those submissions that there is a degree of inconsistency of decision-making across the country, and that thresholds for intervention vary between professions and local authorities. We are told that there are shared common values, but not common standards of training, knowledge and practice. This may be particularly true in the area of neglect, perhaps partly because it is such a difficult area to prove. Now, a related issue may be the difficulties that local authorities have in retaining competent, experienced and qualified staff in frontline childcare practice. There is clearly, we are told, a lack of professional or financial advantage for social workers to remain in the field. Invariably, as in everything else, a common theme in the evidence we have so far is that of resources. Now, many have drawn the committee's attention to the impact on decision-making of the availability of placements and the cost of removal. Now, I'm sure many people don't think of me naive, and I don't want to sound naive here, but frankly, why are the costs of taking a child into care a barrier? Is the focus too much on pounds as opposed to the bigger picture? Curiously, none of the written evidence that has provided any estimate of how much is spent on the overall child protection system, and to date we have not been able to ascertain whether current spend is adequate and providing value for money. Now, there are areas that the committee will consider further, particularly in the light of the Scottish Government's preventative spending agenda. Now, I am clear that these difficult decisions should be made in the best interests of the child and not because of a lack of resources. And I know that that view is shared across this chamber, despite the difficulties that that particular point produces. Another barrier highlighted to the committee, and one that I suspect resonates with many people, is about the speed of decision-making and the length of time it can take for final decisions to be reached for a looked-after child. Now, the reasons given for delays are numerous, and I'm sure perfectly legitimate in many cases, but they include an overly optimistic approach taken by some professionals and children's hearings towards reuniting children with their birth parents. Decisions being made based on pressure from parents in preference to reports from professionals recommending removal from the parental home, and general tensions between the rights of the parents and the rights of the child throughout the decision-making processes. I'm acutely aware that these are complex issues and that overly simplistic solutions will not suffice. Nevertheless, there is clear evidence that many consider that it is currently taking too long for children to reach permanence, and have already identified some of the reasons for that. Well, those were some of the main barriers that have been highlighted to the committee so far. I expect, and I'm sure others do, that as we go along, many more will be highlighted to the committee. It's, however, gratifying that whilst barriers to progress were identified, thus far we have received no evidence suggesting that the system is broken, even if improvement is required. That's encouraging, and it shows that whilst there are challenges to improve the system to ensure that it delivers in the interests of children, there is a willingness to look critically at how to improve outcomes. The challenge for us, the challenge for the Education Committee, the challenge for MSPs, for government, for local authorities, for all decision makers, is to remain positive, remain constructive, and to strive to improve the system. Full implementation of getting it right for every child has been mentioned again and again as being key to improving the decision-making process on whether to take children into care. And the Scottish Government, of course, has announced that it is looking to legislate on this area. Now, I believe that the committee's inquiry is therefore timely. It will shine a light on how decisions are made, whether these differ across the country and between agencies, and the extent to which resource constraints form part of the decision-making process. It will take place immediately prior to the Government introducing a bill that touches on these very areas, and in my view, this allows for better scrutiny, and that potentially means better legislation. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, down the line, I hope that the work of the Education Committee, the policies being pursued by the Government, and the combined efforts of local authorities, the professionals, foster carers and adopters leads to more informed and clearer decision-making, and ultimately, what we all want to achieve, better outcomes for some of our most vulnerable children.
Thank you. I now call Graham Pearson to be followed by John McAlpine.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. First of all, can I welcome the creation and inception of National Adoption Week, an important week in the calendar for Scotland. At one time, an education department in the central belt of Scotland had a tight line which said, "Every child is special." And I think that the contributions today reflect the true understanding that every child deserves to be treated as special, entitled to love, support, to feel secure in their environment, and to know that there are adults around to support and help them be all they can be in this life. And if there were no other reasons to justify why the government should place a priority on adoption and fostering, then I think those reasons are sufficient in themselves. But for those who need additional worldly reasons, Audit Scotland reported just under 2 years ago that £250 million is spent annually on local authority residential care for our children. They acknowledged in that report that the service that they received were not always of best quality, and it was difficult to demonstrate that value was achieved in that spend. It was a shock to realise that the cost per child was £150,000 per year to the public purse. And yet, although there are no statistics here in Scotland, and that's one of the issues that, as others have referred to, we need to remedy, elsewhere in the UK, it is realised that children who are in care and come from a care background are 13 times more likely to end up in our prison population. And that 27% of prisoners currently in custody in England and half of all prisoners under 25 come from a care background. Those statistics are shocking in themselves, and there's no doubt that these children should not have to go through that experience and end up with that result. It's a failure on our behalf, it's a failure on society's behalf. And the efforts that the government and those engaged with National Adoption Week are to be applauded. Much has been said about the bureaucracy, which is considerable, and delays children being taken into care and on to some kind of permanent arrangement. And there is no doubt that these bureaucratic processes need to be revisited. The example given by a member of waiting 6 years to offer a stable home environment to a person who requires that support is in itself shocking and needs to be dealt with. However, I couldn't let today go by without acknowledging one family in South Lanarkshire who offered themselves as foster parents, the Mackenzie family, and who, desirous of a baby or toddler, eventually had a troubled teenager given into their care, a teenager who unfortunately eventually assaulted the mother of the house and she died as a result of that assault. And I highlight that not to try and cause any caution on behalf of those in the Chamber in taking this issue forward. I highlight it for two reasons. One, it's important that we take due consideration of the kinds of threats and challenges that we face in dealing with troubled children. And second, I would say that in delaying removing a child from a difficult background enables us then to have a troubled young adolescent that someone somewhere has got to manage. And a delay of 10 years has been mentioned previously, as I say, only contributes to these difficulties. Much has already been said about the more than 16,000 children in our care currently. 2% of that number are under a year old, 19% under 4 years old, and 37% between 5 and 11 years old. 42% are over 12 years of age. And yet, although we have over 16,000 children, adoptions still maintain at a relatively low number. These children cry out for a stable background. These children cry out for the support and some kind of direction in their life. And the points that were made earlier by Nanette Milne and reinforced by Nigel Dawn are the kind of life raft that these children require and require urgently. And it is beholding on us to find a way through the morass that keeps those that need from the circumstances that can support them. National Adoption Week is important because it focuses and raises awareness of the needs of children and the requirement for more adults in our society to come forward. I would encourage the Minister to achieve robust data overseeing the decision-making process, not only to move children on quickly, but ensure that those adults who come forward and offer their services have had the right risk assessment done in relation to the kind of relationship that they're entering into and get the kind of support they need to deal with children who have come from challenging, difficult and sometimes damaged backgrounds.
Could you come to a conclusion, please?
In finishing, I support the motion from the Government and the amendment supplied by Neil Biddy, and I look forward to hearing more contributions from others in the Chamber. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I now call Joan McAlpine to be followed by Margaret McDougall.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I also welcome this important debate in Parliament today during National Adoption Week, and I'd like to commend the Minister's comments encouraging as many people as possible to rule themselves in as potential adopters. We all owe it to the young people waiting for a loving home to address some of the myths about adoption, and it's worth repeating that being on a low income, being unemployed, being older or single does not rule you out as a potential adopter. Although I was concerned by the Minister's comments that Scottish Government information from local authorities had discovered that some local authorities were still putting a cap on an age cap on potential adopters. And it seems to me that with so many professional women having babies naturally from the age of 40 onwards, it seems unfair and illogical to rule out people of 40 and above as potential adopters. I am pleased that the Minister recognises that and plans to take that forward. However, I think it's worth saying that successful adoption, while it may be the ideal solution for some children, it's important to get the placement right for the child, as the example by Graham Pearson illustrates. We can't rush the process and do more damage because the interest of the child must be paramount. These are difficult issues, and I want to commend an excellent speech by my colleague Stuart Maxwell, the convener of the Education Committee, outlining some of the evidence that has already come in regarding our forthcoming inquiry into the best time to intervene. How do we get the balance right between supporting parents in difficulty and realising early enough that no amount of family support can turn things round for a particular child in a troubled family? We do know that for those children who do require a placement outside the family, it takes too long to establish permanence. And has already been mentioned, in March last year, the Scottish Children's Reporter published a report on care and permanence planning for looked after children, which found that for most children, achieving permanence took more than 2 years from their first involvement with services to adoption or a permanence order. The shortest time was 12.5 months, and as has already been said on a number of occasions, the longest time was a staggering 10 years and 10 months, which is completely unacceptable, particularly when you consider that all of the 100 children studied for the report were under 4 years old, and 44% were assessed as being at risk either before or at birth. This is all very worrying, but I am pleased that the Minister recognises that concern and is taking forward actions to address it. The Scottish Government's response to the SCRA report was ambitious and robust. The Government, as the Minister has already acknowledged, established the Centre of Excellence for Looked After Children, and I welcome the fact that the Centre has established a permanence team looking at how decisions can be reached more quickly. I also note concerns expressed in the briefing that have been received from Barnardo's that decision-making by local authorities is inconsistent and often based on poor information, and I very much hope that the Celsius work will address that. Barnardo's also point out that GIRFEC is not being properly and consistently applied by all our local authorities, and so it's right that the Scottish Government enshrines GIRFEC in law through the Children and Young People's Bill. It's also right that the Scottish Government plans to work with local authorities on the use of permanence orders, and it's right that the Scottish Government have promoted and indeed insisted upon the use of the National Adoption Register more widely as a way forward in the Children and Young People's Bill. I welcome the Government's commitment also to promoting the use of foster carers as adopters and as permanent long-term carers. During the last parliamentary session, the Education and Culture Committee heard evidence from the fostering network during their inquiry into the educational attainment of looked after children. It was worth noting that the fostering network pointed out that school attendance is almost 20% higher for fostered children than it is for looked after children who remain at home with their parents. But I think it's worth adding that educational achievement is just one good reason to achieve permanence at an early stage. As has been mentioned by other speakers, attachment is vitally important. Establishing a loving bond with a caring adult is vital in ensuring good mental health happiness and success throughout life. And for that reason, I welcome this debate, and I particularly welcome the Minister's revelation that Celsius are conducting a world-leading study into the issue of attachment, which I think is at the very centre of the issue that we're discussing today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I call Margaret McDougall to be followed by Gil Patterson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome this opportunity to speak in this important debate during Adoption Week. During my time as a councillor in North Ayrshire, I sat on the adoption panel, so I know first-hand how challenging and complex the process can be at local levels. With this in mind, I'm going to firstly focus on the issues North Ayrshire Council are experiencing currently and the kind of trends they are witnessing before going on to touch on kinship care. In North Ayrshire in 2010-11, there has been a significant increase in children being approved for adoption or permanent fostering, while only 4 were matched in 2009, 17 were matched in 2010 and 12 were matched in 2011. There is a similar increase in children who have been matched with foster carers on a permanent basis, rising from 3 in 2010 to 10 in 2011. There are, of course, many reasons that can lead to a child being put up for adoption, and children come from a variety of different backgrounds and circumstances. However, North Ayrshire Council notes that there has been a worrying trend in the number of children who have been looked after and accommodated due to parental substance misuse and the subsequent neglect that this can lead to. So it is clear that the issues of adoption and permanence can't stand alone, and in our strategies we should have a multifaceted approach that not only makes the adoption process seamless and stress-free for the child involved, but also tackles the deep-seated issues that have led to the children being in this situation in the first place. This issue is not unique to North Ayrshire. All over Scotland, adoption services are struggling to find adoptive parents. This is despite the Adoption and Children Scotland Act being amended to include a wider range of people who are allowed to adopt. Since this change in 2009, North Ayrshire has seen a steady increase in unmarried and same-sex couples looking to adopt. While this is an improvement, which we are now starting to see the benefit of, we still need to do more to promote adoption, and I welcome the work that is being done in Adoption Week, but this should be continuous throughout the year. The increase in children up for adoption and the cost of matching them to suitable families is an additional pressure on the scarce resources of local authorities, who are facing further budget cuts from this government this year. We have to protect the most vulnerable in society, and we have to get it right for every child, particularly where we have corporate responsibility, and they should not have to suffer because of the cuts in the services designed to protect them. As Bernardo Scotland points out, social workers already have a high caseload and are overworked, so local and central government must work together to make sure they are properly resourced. We also need to look at kinship carers and how we can best support them by recognising the contribution they make in reducing the load on the adoption system. At the start of 2012, over 3,000 children were in kinship care. This is estimated to increase as this is now the first port of call for looked-after children. While there are no official reasons to explain the rise in kinship care, it would appear it could be due to the increasing number of children up for adoption, or an adoption system which is cumbersome and under-resourced, and or a demand in exceeding supply of people willing to adopt or foster. Or it could be that social services recognise that in most cases it is considered better for the child's well-being if they are placed with close friends or family. However, if we are making more use of kinship care, we need to make sure that proper support and training is in place. In 2011, Citizens Advice Scotland found that some kinship carers had to take time off work or give up employment altogether, and that 55% of kinship carers who could receive kinship care allowance were unsure of their eligibility and were not claiming it. I would argue that all family members who care for another's child or children should receive support and training, as no matter why they are looking after a child, they are still giving them the same care as foster carers and adoptive parents. Presiding Officer, we need to have a realistic policy objectives to help all family members who care for another's child and give them the proper support that they all deserve, because at the end of the day, it is the child that must come first, and if a family member can help, they should be assisted in doing so. Apart from reducing the stress for the child, it takes pressure off the adoption system. The policies must also include a more robust data collection at a national level and adequate support for social services. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Gil Patterson to be followed by Claire Adamson.
Presiding Officer, I'm very pleased to be able to take part in this debate on permanence and adoption, and it's particularly pleasing to be involved in this National Adoption Week. Presiding Officer, being interested in all matters relating to adoption, I listened to a phone-in programme on this very issue on Monday. Many of the callers were in one way or another concerned by the time that the process of adoption takes. Let me say from the outset, when it comes to bureaucracy, which is in place for no good reason, but can lead to frustration, then all that can be done should be done to minimise and cut this red tape. However, we need to appreciate that every single child available for adoption, without exception, that's a strong claim to make, so I'll read it again, that every single child available for adoption, without exception, has had some kind of traumatic event which makes them available for adoption in the first place. Therefore, the red tape that I'm referring to is not in any way the vital and necessary time spent in assessing the prospective new parents and their circumstances in order to ensure that they are able to properly look after a child who is in need of adoption. A child, for example, who may have been abandoned as a baby, not unheard of, particularly in overseas adoption, or may have been abused by a birth parent and taken into care by the relevant authorities. In one way or another, we have a child who is in a fragile state and very much in need of the protection of a loving parent who can offer the long-term stability so essential to children, whether they are adopted or not. The worst thing that could happen to a baby or a child seeking adoption is that the system is rushed. The system must ensure that proper, in-depth knowledge is gathered to assert and confirm that when a placement is made, the first and last principle must be for the child, although the process requires the patience of Solomon. The child at all times must come first. My wife and I went through the patience mill. It's a hard mill to go through, I've got to say, waiting 3.5 years from start of the process to the end to adopt our daughter, Lucy. The time and process involved in checking that we were suitable parents for the long well-being of our daughter was vital in so many ways, from home visits to background reports and police reports. All were done with one intention, to ensure that children, babies or older children, who have at least had one bad experience and perhaps a few in their short lives, don't have another. Our daughter was only 2 years old when we adopted her, having lived her life up until then in an orphanage. But she was an extremely well-behaved and happy baby, I've got to say, and still is, I've got to say. She's now coming up for 12. Still my baby. My wife and I agree that those people who have put themselves forward to adopt an older child, a child who perhaps has what is commonly referred to as baggage, that is a child who has had a traumatic experience at a young age, but adopters make that child part of the family. Part of the family. What a goal and what an achievement. We both believe they are living saints. It's clear from all the studies that the sooner a child is permanently placed with a family, the sooner the child begins a process of secure attachment. And that integration in family belonging takes effect well at the same time. Again, my focus is on the child in this regard, and I would suggest that all should be done to build up a bank, if you like, of prospective parents who have been approved, so that as soon as it is practically possible to do so, a child can be placed when they have been recognised in law for adoption. This wasteful delay in dealing with the cases has the potential to turn prospective parents away from adopting, and it would be in the child's interest to ensure that the process is as speedily as possible. But it would have to have an impact on the prospective parents also and their existing families. Whilst we seek to create a positive and fresh new life for each adopted child, we must not forget the positive effects on their new family and parents. These parents take great pride in their adopted child's achievements, as if, in fact, they were their own child, from their first step or words to their passing of school exams. So much so that it would be impossible for anyone to realise that a child was adopted. That's the ultimate accolade for any family, in my view. Presiding Officer, I'm indeed pleased to help raise awareness of adoption, and I'm sure that this debate can only bring positive for individuals who all benefit from adoption: the child, the parent and the extended family. A caring, loving home is what every parent wants for their child, and for adopted parents to offer the chance is something to be recognised. This Parliament is at its very best when it's discussing these matters, when we all come together. I fully commend the motion to the Parliament, whilst offering a thanks to all those who put themselves in this position. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now call Claire Adamson to be followed by Hanzala Malik.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am very honoured to be able to speak in this debate this afternoon. As Gil Patterson has said, it is one of these debates that shows the Parliament in its best light. I would like to particularly commend Neil Bibby and Liam MacArthur in the way that they moved their respective motions this afternoon. And as a member of the Education and Culture Committee, I also welcome Stuart Maxwell's comprehensive summary of the work that the committee has been doing in this area. It seems only a short time since we were discussing adoption and permanency in the Parliament, and I remember then hearing the speeches of both Gil Patterson and Richard Lyle, and also today Nanette Millen. If anyone was looking for a very positive example, an outcome from the adoption process, they need look no further than this chamber. And it's been very moving to hear them give their personal experiences in this area. As the stated aim of the Scottish Government is for Scotland to be the best place in the world to grow up, it's a very bold and ambitious statement, but rightly so. And there is no doubt that despite our understanding of the poor educational and life outcomes for looked after children, we have failed in the past, not through effort and not through the best will of the professionals involved, but as Liam MacArthur mentioned in his speech, this is just a nut we haven't been able to crack, and we haven't been able to really get to the nub of this problem and actually start to make a real difference for our looked after children. Cabinet Secretary has mentioned the many projects now on the way in the organisations that have been galvanised into tackling this problem, including Celsius, LACSIG, and many of the third sector organisations in the area, such as Aberlour Trust, Children First and Bernardo's. With so many excellent contributions and the information in the Chamber this afternoon, it's difficult to find a new slant in this, but I would maybe like to highlight a recent report from Who Cares Scotland. They have conducted a survey of young people, and it's really supporting information from young people in care and care leavers for the Children and Young People's Bill. And it's young people's experience of being in care in Scotland. And while we've talked a lot about the professionals, I think it's interesting to actually hear the voices of the young people this afternoon. Who Cares Scotland is an organisation offering independent advocacy for children and young adults. And it conducted a survey of 116 young people in care and care leavers to gather their views on the Children and Young People Bill. Who Cares want the voice of children and young people to be heard in the consultation and the deliberation processes that aim to deliver better outcomes for them. They have made comment on a number of areas which I think are relevant to today's debate and permanence. Young people ask what they would think would have made their life better before going into care. And 13% of the young people mentioned communication and preparation. Many of them felt that they had no idea of what going into care would mean for them and for their families. 16% of them mentioned support before going into care would also have been of great help. And the third quotes are more support to avoid care as well. So there's certainly a wish for young people that the support maybe should have happened a bit earlier for them. They wish to be communicated with and to have a better understanding of what to expect going forward in the future. If I could quote from one young person in the report, "It was all too quick. I never got the time to pack my things. I would have liked more time to prepare and also to be told that going into care was an option, as it was all a shock to me when it happened. I never got to say goodbye to my friends either, which I didn't like." Who Cares also asked the young people what they think would have made their life better whilst in care. 28% of them said the care environments, and 11% of them said it was just being listened to. And a little word of caution to the Scottish Government and the Minister and all the professionals involved in this area. Only 1% of the young people mentioned early intervention. So while I absolutely agree with the process of early intervention and I agree that it's the right way forward, perhaps we still need to be communicating that better to some of our young people. It's interesting that the care environment was such of high importance to young people. And they mentioned things as simple as that they weren't allowed to charge their mobile phones in their bedrooms due to health and safety. And as a mother of a teenage son, I can only imagine what stresses that must have caused to the young people involved. And the environment became very evident to the Education Committee when we visited a children's unit in Glasgow. And we were concerned that the young residents, for whom this had been their permanent home for a number of years and was likely to remain their permanent home till they left care, could still be subjected to disruption and upset from emergency admissions to that home. And the young people also were asked about which people had most influence in their lives, and Neil Bibby mentioned the work of social workers and how key, and it's interesting that young people cite social workers as being the most important relationship outside of their family, but they also mentioned the role of advocates and care workers, because they feel advocates have got more time to spend with them and more time to get to know them. So it's absolutely evident that all the professionals involved in the young people have a key role to play, and we need to get that right if we're going to get it right for young people. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Hanzala Malik to be followed by Kevin Stewart.
Good afternoon, Presiding Officer. It gives me great pleasure to speak in today's debate, as it is an issue close to my heart. as 23% of Scotland's looked after children are in Glasgow. Yes, in Glasgow. Glasgow has the highest proportion of its children looked after, with 3.2% of the under 18 population in the case of in the care of the local authority. This is more than double the Scottish average of 1.5 and more than any other part in Scotland. I speak about the incredible poor educational outcomes of looked after children in the Chamber last year. Evidence shows that establishing stability and permanence early in life of a child can generate improvement in their life and their chances. I welcome the efforts made to improve the quality and consistency of decision-making on permanence. But I, along with Barnardo's and the National Society for Prevention for Cruelty to Children, would like also to see major improvements on the speed of the process. There are 3 areas where further improvements are required. First, establishing a care plan of permanence. It is vital for the welfare of children to make early and effective decisions in permanence once a child enters the looked after system. Second, and Scottish Children's Reporter Administrator study found that 92% of children in their sample took more than 2 years from first becoming involved with services of being adopted. In one case, as has already been highlighted, that a case took more than 10 years, a ridiculous amount of time that took place. The third area of concern for me is, of course, assisting the adoption process. And I'm particularly interested if the Minister would make comment on what steps are being taken in regards to encouraging the minority communities within Scotland to participate in the scheme. And if she doesn't have the answer today, I'm quite happy to receive it at a later date. I don't want to put it on the spot. However, I think it's important that, many of our communities in Scotland traditionally have been very welcoming of looking after siblings and relatives. And that care project, that care package, I think is very important. We really need to try and stem and stop this bureaucracy that takes too long. And I'll give you a personal example, as was given earlier on. I also went through the adoption process. And after 2 years of interviews and training and visits and people coming to my place and my parents' place and my children were interviewed, and eventually I was told I'm not suitable. And the reason for that was I worked too hard. So I really got very worried. I said, I've already got 2 children. So I said, so you're not taking my children away, are you? So it just shows that my children are okay. They can stay with me even though I work very hard, but I can't adopt anybody else. An interesting phenomenon. A number of children...
Minister.
The points that Mr Malik makes are really very valid. And
Minister, sorry, could you speak to the microphone? Thank you.
And I think it shows why the awareness raising of the Rule Yourself In campaign is so important, because it needs to ensure that a broad spectre of people put themselves forward as adoption or potential adoptive parents. And I think that the illustration that you have presented shows just why we actually need to do a bit of work to ensure that people can actively be ruled in to provide loving, nurturing homes, which I know that you've provided for your own family.
Kantala Malik.
Yeah, thank you very much. I don't know if my children would agree with that, but that said, they managed to achieve good academic results, so they must have got something right. A number of children being looked after in Scotland have grown to 46% over the past decade. A number of babies under the 1 year of age being looked after has almost doubled. This puts a major strain on social work departments, which has already been indicated. And it is essential that local authorities are adequately resourced in order to that decisions on children being looked after are made in the best interest of the child, not as a last resort when a solution has reached a critical point. Bernardos themselves have expressed concerns that too often decisions are reached based rather on resource than on need, and they also urge that early intervention by local authorities and social work departments can save money in the long run. And I have to say that sometimes I feel very sorry for the social work department, because whatever they do, if they don't do it, they're doomed, and if they do it, they don't. They're in a very difficult position, and I think resourcing is obviously an issue for them, but I think more importantly, what will really change things around for us is the time factor. I think we need to be more sensitive of how we deal with these issues. We really need to shrug off the ancient and historic ways that we've dealt with issues in the past, and therefore I genuinely believe that time, speed and promotion of the issue are very important, and I look forward to the Minister's summing up in terms of what else support local authorities can receive in that bid. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I now call Kevin Stewart to be followed by Willie Coffey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I had the privilege of speaking in the debate last year on this issue, and I'm honoured to be called again today. I related in that debate last year that when first being elected to Aberdeen City Council, I was asked the question, how many kids do you have? And I said, I don't have any children. And the response from the official was, well, you now have 300 and odd as of today. And I think that brings home our corporate parenting responsibilities. I have to say it's even more daunting knowing that I'm now the corporate parent of over 16,000 kids, and that is a huge responsibility that I think that none of us should forget. The Minister talked about the corporate parent training that's available very shortly to members. Having done similar training before and GIRFEC training, I think it's immensely important that we as members know what our responsibilities actually are in that regard. Last year, the then Minister Angela Constance said in the debate, if something is not good enough for our own sons and daughters, it is not good enough for any child or young person growing up in Scotland. And I agree entirely with that statement, and we should be aspirational for all of those kids that we are responsible for. Can I pay tribute to all of those folks right across Scotland who are working in children's services at this moment in time? And Mr Malik just now just talked about social work services, and sometimes they're very much put upon because they can't do right for wrong, as many folk have said previously. And I think that we as a Parliament should recognise the good work that goes on across the country and pay tribute to our social workers and put in the adequate protection that is required for them also. In my own constituency, Presiding Officer, I've had the great privilege over the past year and a half to visit a number of services. Just the other week I was volunteering in Bernardo's Union Street shop with Diane and her team there who do sterling work. And at that day was also the lady who heads up Linksfield Residential Services in Aberdeen, which is a Bernardo's run project which I've visited before and hope to visit again. I also highlighted last year Aberdeen City Council's award-winning adoption and fostering service, who are doing sterling work, and I make no apology for mentioning them again in today's speech. However, what I want to concentrate on this afternoon is some of the impediments that are in place round about folks' abilities to become kinship carers. And while doing some research into what GP contracts require GPs to do, an interesting anomaly has been found. I have a letter which I actually received only today from NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, and I'm going to quote from part of that letter. GPs are obliged within their contractual terms it is a national contract, to provide certain reports. The most common are medical certificates and death certificates. For others, it falls into two camps, and it's the first camp that I think that we need to take some cognizance of today. And that is that collaborative fees, where it is recognised that they do work usually for a local authority and then claim a fee. For example, for fostering adoption, GPs can say no to these requests as it's not obligatory. Now, I think that this is probably a little bit of the red tape that has been talked about so much today, and I hope that, that the Minister will follow this up and try and ensure that these become obligatory so that, that the right information can be sought so that we can get on much quicker with fostering and adoption. The other thing which I want to bring to the Chamber's attention is the difficulties that the new welfare reform regime may throw up in terms of placing children. The Welfare Reform Committee visited a housing association just last week to talk about the pilot that they're undertaking round about housing benefit. And one of the women there highlighted the difficulties round about the bedroom tax. Kinship carer, but with no permanency at this moment in time, and she is extremely worried, as are many others, about the impact of the bedroom tax and their ability to be kinship carers. Fine after all of the legal process is finished, but while that is ongoing, while children may still be with them, they may be penalised for having a so-called extra bedroom, even though they have a child living in that area. So I would hope, Minister, that we can lobby very hard the Westminster Government to take account of these silly situations. Folk have talked about early intervention today and the speed of the process, and I can't and don't have the time to go over that. What I would say is that we must secure these children's future, as they are Scotland's future. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer.
And thank you. Now call on Willie Coffey to be followed by Helen Eady. 6 minutes, please, including interventions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. In reading over the excellent briefings for this debate provided by our own research team and also from Barnardo's, there are a number of statistics that one can draw, and members have shared many of them during the debate already. But for me, the standout numbers that took me by surprise are that there are 16,000 children being looked after by Scotland's local authorities, and possibly up to another 15,000 being cared for by relatives in informal arrangements. Just imagine that. Those numbers of children would fill up 2 decent-sized football stadiums in Scotland, and gives us a stark reminder, I think, of the importance of the work that the Scottish Government is doing with our local authorities and the many partner organisations and families who support our children. The Rule Yourself In campaign being promoted this week by Adoption and Fostering Association is as much enlightening as it is moving in the way that it highlights the cases of the youngsters featured. The wishes on a star chart that I saw are wishes of some of the youngsters who yearn for what most children might regard as the ordinary things in life, like having a pet, going swimming or just having fun. But in the absence of a family, parents or brothers and sisters, these ordinary things become the dreams of so many youngsters. So I commend the organisation for the work that it is doing and welcome the number of events planned throughout Scotland, particularly by Barnardo's, to offer potential parents an insight into the process of adoption. As the Minister said when she launched the National Parenting Strategy last month, she isn't starting from scratch, but is pulling together universal services in health, education and social work, combining this with the third sector and bringing it all together under one shared agenda to demonstrate a real commitment to Scotland's children and families. The proposal in the Children and Young People Bill to award rights and responsibilities to our kinship carers not only recognises the work they do, but it gives them a much more stable working environment. For too long, they have been the unsung heroes, perhaps, taken for granted by a system that, while grateful for their intervention on behalf of thousands of youngsters, did little to recompense them for their efforts. Indeed,
Most local authorities now pay kinship care allowances, but it was indeed a fight to get the UK Government to agree not to claw back some of those allowances in order to balance out other benefits. So I think the Minister and her predecessors can be proud of their achievements to date and the widely supported plans contained in the National Strategy. Presiding Officer, had the pleasure during the summer to meet with the Kilmarnock-based team of Who Cares Scotland under the excellent guidance of Jimmy McWilliam and his staff. Who Cares Scotland, as many members will know, provide advocacy support to many youngsters in care settings. Not all of them are destined for adoption, of course, but the discussion I had with Jimmy that day about the work his team does certainly opened my eyes to the needs of our looked-after children. One of the most striking messages was that looked-after children sometimes have little social contact with their friends. So, on top of the obvious challenges that they face in relation to retaining their own family relationships, they can find themselves presented with yet more difficulties simply trying to keep friendships going. Who Cares Scotland asked over 100 youngsters what was important to them in the context of the Young People Bill. And one comment stood out for me in the document, and Claire Adamson already shared that with the Chamber, but I'd just like to repeat that last sentence of it when the young person said, "I never got to say goodbye to my friends either," which I didn't like. Now, the common message from young people in that document was that we had to involve them in the process, tell them what was happening, and give them time to prepare themselves for it. If our purpose is to really put children at the centre of all that we do, then these sentiments must be listened to and acted upon, and I'm sure the Minister will have noted the comments with great interest. Turning to the Care and Permanence Planning report by the Children's Reporter, there's a very helpful section which looks at timescales and some of the causes for delay. The sample offered in the report shows us the 4 stages to achieving permanency, from initial contact, permanence being decided, the lodging of applications and petitions, to orders then being granted. For more than half the children in this particular sample, it took between 1 and 2 years to progress from the point at which permanency had been decided to presenting the petition in court. There were many reasons offered to help us understand the delays in other parts of the process, and as expected, these ranged from attempts at rehabilitation within the families, delays in identifying suitable adoptive parents, and difficulties if other siblings were involved also. But what wasn't so clear to me is why there can be delays of up to 2 years from the point at which permanency has been decided to submitting that application in court for determination. A suggestion from Bernardo's that I think was already mentioned by Nanette and Millen as part of their framework would be to establish clear guidelines on what the timescales should actually be, so that we would all know what to expect. Presiding Officer, from the tone of the discussion on this very important subject and the breadth and depth of work already carried out by the Scottish Government, I'm in no doubt that the Minister and her team have a clear understanding of the issues surrounding looked after children and their journey to permanency and adoption. It seems that we are developing a whole system approach requested by my own council, East Ayrshire, and I'm sure that this is supported by others too. Their additional call for a proactive Scottish-wide approach to finding adopters and long-term carers, perhaps linking this to employability and alternative pathways for people, is an interesting one,
please.
And I hope that the Minister might consider this as she takes her agenda forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now call on Helen Needy to be followed by Mark MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I too am very pleased to take part in this debate today. And we've heard from so many around the Chamber that this is an established maxim that children who are not well cared for and neglected go on, in the main, to have more challenging lives as adults, illustrated so well by Graham Pearson in his contribution this afternoon. In my experience as an MSP and former Fife councillor, that most certainly rings true. The lack of attention, care and love is as important as the concrete requirements of food, clothing and shelter. I am pleased to be able to take part in this important debate on adoption and permanence, which is a controversial but vital issue if we are to better deal with the neglect of thousands of children in this country. For my own part, we've heard around the Chamber, I suppose, almost surprisingly, I had no idea that we had so many colleagues in this chamber who had gone through the process for adoption and had, in the end, become successful, and also to learn about Hanzala's experience. In my own case, my husband and I, we lived in London for over 17 years when I was a trade union official, and in that time we applied for adoption, and it took us about a year and a half to be approved. And I suppose in that sense that period is very short time in comparison to the experiences that we've heard today. But we didn't go on to go through with the whole process, because just at that point my mother-in-law became terminally ill, and then after that, lo and behold, it's nature's way of helping you sometimes. We then had the birth of our youngest daughter, so that was a happy ending in some ways, but there's still a child out there that we might have adopted at one point, but we didn't. For obvious reasons, there has been an almost institutional reluctance to take children from their parents for the purpose of adoption. The usual route is to try every single other avenue, short of removing children from the care of birth parents. In some very high-profile cases, such as baby P and Brandon Muir from Dundee, leaving children with those parents has had catastrophic consequences, and only serves to underline just how vital it is that we give this work our absolute and utmost attention, in view of the points made by the Minister this afternoon, who I commend, by the way, for her diligence that she is showing on this particular issue. I think she's showing great care on this. I do not believe that the children should be placed for adoption without the greatest of care and consideration, but the circus of going from pillar to post can be as distressing for the children that the right balance must be struck. And that is why Liam MacArthur's amendment, I think, is important today. I also think what he says about the situation in England, with 40% of the children being permitted to have earlier access to nursery care, I think is really important as well, and that's why I hope that his motion will meet with some success today. I heard on a radio programme, one of my favourite things as I drive home on a Wednesday evening, it's usually about 9 o'clock or thereabouts as we've finished with some of our receptions in this building, was to listen to the moral maze, and it was about the issue about whether or not to place children of mixed race with families in Scotland or indeed in England. And that is something that my own preference would be to say that if there's a child out there that needs love, care and attention, to me, if there's a family, whether they be gay or whatever, that would be for me a priority of placing that child in a loving environment so that they did not have to go through life and face life's challenges alone. And I agree with the charity, as others have said today, so I'll skip over this bit about the framework, etc., that has been mentioned by Nanette. And also the issues about data collection. I'll just skip over that bit as well, because I think that's been well rehearsed this afternoon. And with the high-profile cases where we have seen the consequences of inaction, the reaction from politicians and the media has been to blame the social workers and the professionals who have to try and make sense of the system. However, these individuals are often just scapegoats for our failings. We need to get the policy right, and that was why I was so very pleased to hear the contribution by Stuart McMillan this afternoon that the committee is looking at this work in depth, and that work has to be commended as well. So it's really vital that we get the right resources to the front line of social work so that children can be properly protected. Cutting local authority budgets by almost 6.5% isn't good either, but it's a fact that, in these hard times, that's one of the things that we have to deal with. I'm absolutely clear that leaving children in chaotic and damaging home environments is not the best option for children. And I just want to make sure that as we move forward in our discussions, that this will be something that will be taken on board by the government, that we need to attend to these urgently. Before I sit down, I just want to ask the Minister to take some initiatives of sharing knowledge and experience. She knows my interest in the wider European situation. And one of the most moving things that I saw when I first visited Romania was when I saw children there, beggars in the street. That was then endorsed by Cardinal Keith O'Brien when he was here in this building. These are the poorest children in Europe, as a consequence of Ceausescu's policies that he had at that time of closing down children's homes. They just closed the children's homes, and it meant that those children ended up on the streets as beggars without anyone. I hope that, Minister, you could take an initiative with Romania to look at how we could share knowledge and experience with them, and I'd be happy to meet with the Minister to explore how further we can do that. I do have a team of Romanians coming to the Parliament tomorrow. It's short notice for you, but I hope you will give a sympathetic hearing to how we could do that. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Now call on Mark MacDonald to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. As a parent of 2 young children, the welfare of children and young people in Scotland is an issue that is extremely close to my heart. I want to explore a number of areas in my speech, the first of which is around the importance of corporate parenting. It was emphasised to me very early in my days as a councillor in Aberdeen by my then group leader, one councillor Kevin Stewart, whatever happened to him, that it was extremely important that we took our roles as corporate parents seriously. And I think it's very important that members at all levels take the opportunities of training and involvement within corporate parenting strategies. One of the things which often struck me was that there was often a feeling that those members at a council level who were not part of the administration perhaps didn't either recognise or appreciate the role that they had as corporate parents, and often felt that it was a responsibility and a burden that fell only on those councillors who were in administration. I think maybe it would be worth re-emphasising to all local authority members that they all have a role as a corporate parent, regardless of whether or not they are a member of the council's administration or not. And my colleague Kevin Stewart mentioned the good practice at Aberdeen City Council, and I think it's important that when we talk about best practice that we don't just highlight it, but we also look at ways in which it can be shared and in which ways in which other local authorities, we've heard examples today of areas where there may be room for improvement or where local authorities may not be delivering what could be described as best practice. I think where a fostering and adoption service such as Aberdeen's has been nationally recognised, it is one that perhaps should be highlighted to those councils as an area which they may want to look at. Also within Aberdeen, during my time as a councillor, we saw investment in bringing children's homes back to a standard which would allow us to bring children back to Aberdeen from what were often extremely expensive and also counterproductive out-of-area placements. I heard the comments from the Net Milne around, sometimes we have to send children out of area, and I would agree that there will be occasions when that will be necessary. However, it became the case that all too often it was not happening because it was the best option, but because in many cases it was the only option, because the investment to enable placements within the local authority area simply had not been there in the past. But thanks to investment in, for example, the Willows and also in the Gilbert Road Children's Home, which was in my former council ward, we've seen an ability to reverse some of those decisions that were taken, which were not proving to be the best decisions either for the individual or for the local authority. But beyond that as well, we have to look at the wider children's home estates and work out where children's homes are no longer fit for purpose. And indeed, one of the things which happened in Aberdeen was one of the children's homes in my ward, the Nether Hills Children's Home, which was not fit for purpose, was closed. So as well as looking at investment, we also have to look at where children's homes are appropriate. But in terms of the issue around adoption, I think one of the most powerful things we can do is smash some of the myths, and it was pleasing to hear the comments from my colleague Joan McAlpine around the issues around age and how age is often viewed as a barrier to people coming forward for adoption. The most important criteria, I think, for people adopting should be the ability to give love and security, and that can happen no matter what the age of the individual, and we have to get beyond that all too often, that stigmatisation that surrounds age. Indeed, I saw comments from the Bath Chief Executive, David Holmes, talking about the need to grapple with myths and to ensure that people are not ruling themselves out, but ruling themselves in when it comes to adoption. I think Margaret McDougall made an interesting point around the fact that we need to look at whether placements with the family are the best thing, and I would agree with that. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think the work that has been done around kinship care, both in terms of the introduction of kinship carer payments, but also the work that's going to be done by the government in terms of enshrining the role of kinship carers in statute as part of the Children and Young People Bill, I think that's extremely important as well. But the point about this, and I think the point that has rung true throughout the whole debate, is the importance of having children at the centre. I think that while I've listened very carefully to a lot of members saying that we need to speed up the process, and I would agree that in many cases the process is taking far too long, the most important thing for me is that we have to make sure that we get it right, and that it is right for the child, rather than simply being quick. If we can improve speed and still get it right for the child, that for me is a winning combination. But we should never allow ourselves to sacrifice the rights of the child simply for speed of process, and that has to be the main focus that we have. Finally, Presiding Officer, the BAF website, the National Adoption Week website, has been collecting wishes of children who are wishing to be adopted, and I thought I would take the opportunity to share some of these. They go from the touching to the amusing. Phoebe, aged 5, says, "I wish for a family that can show me love and patience." Robbie, aged 4, and his brother Simon, aged 6, say, "We wish to have a family who will look after us, give us cuddles and have fun with us." There's Ellie, aged 4, who wishes for a mummy who will make my hair look nice. We then have Jack, aged 5, who says, "I wish for a monkey, puppies and cats and dogs." So if there's anybody watching the debate or reading the official report who has a monkey at home, you could be the person that Jack is looking for. And lastly, we have Corey, aged 7, who says, "I wish for 2 dads so I don't have to share with my younger brother." And on the days when I have one child in my arms and the other child tugging at me in order to get my attention, I can sympathise with that sentiment, Presiding Officer.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Now call on Malcolm Chisholm to be followed by George Adams. 6 minutes,
Presiding
please.
Officer, I welcome this debate and the Minister's speech, which she started by referring to the recent report by the Scottish Children's Reporter Administration on permanent planning, which I found an interesting and worrying read at the weekend. The report underlined the importance of securing decisions about permanent homes for looked-after children, but found, as many speakers have reminded us, that there were worrying delays in making such decisions. And I think we're familiar with some of the figures in that report. Now over half of the children in the study took more than 4 years to achieve permanence. Moreover, nearly half experienced at least 3 moves, and over a quarter at least 4 moves, before achieving permanence. Now, given the importance of secure attachments, which again was a major theme of the Minister's speech, and particularly, I think we believe now, secure attachments in the very early years, it is surely essential that services intervene as early as possible to support children and achieve permanence. And because of that, I very much welcome the Government's Care and Permanence Plan from 2011, with its emphasis on responding to the needs of children as early as possible. I also welcome the establishment of CELCHIS. I'm not quite sure what the correct way to pronounce that is. CELCHIS, as the Minister told us, had a dedicated care and permanence team, and I'm sure we also look forward to the comprehensive work that she referred to on attachment theory. Now, in some conversations that I had prior to the debate, it was put to me that there was a lack of adoption experts within CELCHIS. I hope that is not true, but perhaps the Minister, in her winding up or in correspondence later, can tell me whether that piece of information given to me is correct or not. Of course, this debate is not just about adoption, but I do want to concentrate on that particular aspect, because I became interested in that subject after a constituent came to one of my surgeries a few months ago, and what she told me and the subsequent work I did on that certainly opened up a particular perspective on the adoption process. And I accept it's only one perspective, but I will give it, because I think it does perhaps add something to the points that have been made by other speakers in the debates today. Now, the experience that she had she told me, highlighted several aspects of the problem. First, she said that the children she was seeking to adopt had been kept for too long in the family home. I know that's a common complaint, and I understand the complexities of that, but I think it's important to place that comment by my constituent on the record. She said there were further delays from moving from the previous foster carer to herself and her husband as foster carers, because now everything has to be referred back and forth between the sheriff and the hearing. Apparently that didn't happen in the past. She then talked about a 2-year process for adoption after all that, and highlighted problems in following the letter of the 2007 Adoption Act. For example, she said one sheriff didn't specify zero contact with the birth parents, although that has to be explicit, and that caused the delay. But a more significant problem arose because the judiciary lodged the application in the wrong jurisdiction, and that led to an appeal, and the whole process had to start all over again. In the second judicial round, my constituent described 2 gruelling weeks in the Court of Session, being grilled by the counsels for the other side and the social workers, she said, endured the same grilling. She commented that there is a major disparity between what is happening legally and what social workers are doing in their day-to-day work and decision-making. Now, hopefully, the new court rules that are coming around timetabling and judicial management will help, and in particular proposals to change sheriff court rules to enable a more proactive role for sheriffs at a much earlier stage. When I discussed the concerns of my constituent, however, with a family law lawyer, I was given a further worrying perspective, which suggested a fundamental problem with the 2007 Adoption Act, which, of course, the government of which I was a part introduced into Parliament. This lawyer described to me how the legal process is getting bogged down in lengthy disputes, and referred in particular to Section 31 of that Act, which she said completely defeats the aim of taking the focus on parental blame out of adoption and making the welfare of the child the principal focus. In particular, she said that the courts are now clogged up with cases taking weeks to resolve and huge sums of public money in order to satisfy Section 31(4)(b) of the Act. Now, in the majority of cases, the child will have gone through the full gamut of child protection and children's hearing proceedings before having been placed for adoption, and yet the court is often faced with days and days of evidence from social workers having to rehearse all the ways in which the parents failed in the past, simply in order to meet the legal test for dispensing with consent. And the lawyer that I had this conversation with suggested that there should be a much more simple test of safeguarding the child's welfare, amended to reflect the necessity test of Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights. And I was concerned to be told that that was the recommendation of the Adoption Working Group that met for years before the 2007 Act, but that there were amendments in the process of that going through Parliament which changed that. I did find that conversation actually very interesting from the point of view of legislation and the need for post-legislative scrutiny, quite apart from the specific points that she was making. So I hope the Minister will look at that particular point, which I offer in order to put a slightly different perspective on it, but I end by very much welcoming her speech and the announcements that she made today.
Thank you very much. I now call on George Adam, after which we'll move to closing speeches. George Adam, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome this debate on permanence and adoption. I also support the aims of National Adoption Week and the tone of this debate. I think Gil Patterson is correct, as always, when he says that when we have debates like this, we show this Parliament at its best, because we're dealing with real issues, real problems and real solutions to these issues as well, and we're dealing with people's lives and, in some cases, some of the most difficult to reach and looked after children that we're dealing with. And as today's debate has been like spot the ex-councillor, effectively, because we've all had various times when we've been councillors and we've taken on the role as corporate parenting. And when you do look at it as a corporate parent, the first thing you actually say is that it's only then, when they talk to you about it, that you truly understand that we do have a role to look after these children as well. And it's a term that you hear probably as you go by your life normally before you're an elected member, but it's only then that you truly, when you become like an elected member in a local authority, you're there at the coalface, you're actually seeing what's happening, even down to when you're at surgeries and various families come in and you're dealing with their own situation. And it can be heartbreaking and quite difficult. But I think Kevin Stewart's already mentioned, Presiding Officer, what Angela Constance said last week, but you weren't here, so I'll possibly maybe mention it again, that Angela Constance said if something is not good enough for our own sons and daughters, it's not good enough for any child or young person growing up in Scotland. And I agree with that then, and I do so again, and I'm pleased that the Minister, Aileen Campbell, has reaffirmed this position today, because I think we have to ensure that we all work towards a goal of making Scotland the best place to grow up in. And I think we have to ensure that we take up this role as a corporate parent. It's important that looked after children gain a permanent home quickly, and I welcome the fact that the child will be at the centre of all this. Joan McAlpine and others have already said that the Children's Reporter published a report on care and permanence planning last year for looked after children, and the thing that came out for me is the fact it takes over 2 years in most cases for children to find some form of permanence, and that's a worry, because we have a situation where the sooner we can actually help these children, these looked after children, a lot easier it's going to be for them. There are other situations, of course, that came up during the debate and has been mentioned as well, is that there are challenges when you try to leave children with their birth parents. There can be, as has been happened in various areas, some tragic circumstances if you work towards that way. And there are other times, in the majority, where it actually can work out. So these are all debates and things that we have to look to, and I can understand why the timescales can be quite difficult to obviously get things. We have to make sure that we get everything correct and above board. But, OK, this is National Adoption Week, Presiding Officer, and rule yourself in. Many families will be completely unaware of this idea, because a lot of families will actually think that they're either too old, too young, they have a different lifestyle, they won't be accepted to be someone who could be an adopted parent. And this is something we have to promote and ensure that people actually know that this is available to them and they can get involved. The Minister is correct that we need to ensure uniformity across local authorities, because I can say as an ex-councillor myself that you often heard there was various stories from other authorities that were different from your own authority that you're working in, and I think that causes more problems in what is a very difficult situation to begin with. And I think local authorities need to make it simpler to access support for families, because on a lot of occasions we have a situation where it is actually the kinship carers who are taking up, and I welcome the government's support of this in continuation, because it is a natural progression for grandparents and other members of the family to, in a difficult situation, to go in there and help. We've been doing it for generations, but I think we have to sit there and say there are more older people doing that, especially in my constituency. I can name a couple of cases that I have myself, and we need to ensure we support these people as well and these families, because they have already gone through some difficult cases, a difficult situation at that point, and I think we have to ensure that we make it easier and access for support a lot better. But, Presiding Officer, once again, we're debating a subject that we all agree on, because this decision will make a difference for all our children and young people and can change the pathway that young person may take. I take my corporate parenting role seriously, and as such will continue to support the Scottish Government's ambitious ideas in this area. A family member of mine recently came to me and actually asked about adoption, and although I take my corporate parent role seriously, I did actually give him the details, but then I asked instantly, went home to my wife and says, what do they want to do that for? Why are they asking these questions? Now that becomes part of the problem as well. You know, I gave them all the information, and this is a kind of ideal and idea that we all have to get over. So I would say we have to get over that feeling and ensure that we support people when they come up with an idea of going for adoption, because the future of our children is the most important thing for everyone here in Scotland.
Thank you very much. And before we move to closing speeches, I just remind all members who have taken part in the debate they should be in the chamber for the closing speeches. Now call on Liam MacArthur, 6 minutes or thereby, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I would certainly agree with Claire Adamson, I think George Adam and others, that this has been a debate that's shown Parliament at its best. I think that is perhaps due no small part to the fact that, as Helen Eady pointed out, there's a surprising number of members in the Chamber who have personal experience of the adoption process. I think if I could maybe draw a diplomatic veil over Hanzala Malik's attempt to try and put his own kids up for adoption, there was a variety of experiences. Richard Lyles had clearly been quite a tortuous one at various points. I think Gil Patterson clearly has no attachment problems whatsoever with his 12-year-old baby. But I think I would offer the role as poster child for the Roll Yourself In campaign to Nanette Milne, who I think exemplified where, when this process is got right, the benefits both to the child or the children involved, but also to those doing the adopting, are almost immeasurable. I think she was also right, Presiding Officer, to point to the bravery of the birth parents in that process as well. I think the scale of the challenge is not to be underestimated. Kevin Stewart and others have drawn attention to the almost 16,000 looked after children we have in this country, and yet adoption accounts for somewhere around 300 or so cases. I think there are particular areas where problems exist. Those with complex needs were referred to by some. Hanzala Malik also drew attention to the problems in relation to ethnic minorities, but also the pressures in Glasgow. I think for somebody who represents an island community like Orkney, it's probably at the other end of the spectrum, but nevertheless there are tensions there, not least because if a placement can't be found and has to involve a placement out of Ireland, it can be quite a dramatic, significant and potentially traumatic experience. So overall, I think there's an acceptance of the need to increase the number of potential foster carers and adopters. I think the register is a step very much in the right direction in that respect. It will provide more matching opportunities, which brings with it, I think, the opportunities to speed up the process. And I think George Adam and others, referring to the support that goes in for families who do put themselves up for this process, absolutely critical. The importance of getting it right early on, I think, was reflected in every member's speech in this debate. The child with attachment difficulties inevitably, or almost inevitably, becomes an adult with the same very issues. The right to a loving, supportive, secure environment is one that we would expect for our own children. As Angela Constant reminded the Chamber in a previous debate, it's one we should expect for those that are looked after. The costs of early intervention, we cannot duck this, are high, but the costs of not acting are far, far higher. And I think Graham Pearson made a number of very important points in that respect, not least in terms of the percentage of numbers that find themselves in prison or in difficulty later on in life. I think at this point I would probably extend my plea again for the Government to look at how we might extend early education to more 2-year-olds in Scotland, as this appears to be one way of delivering a greater level of positive early intervention. The impact of the delays, again, were a feature of most members' speeches. I think one of the points that wasn't made in this debate, but has been made in previous debates, is that the timeframes for a child are very different than for those of an adult. And actually, 6 months or a year in the life, in the perspective of a child, is a very, very different quantum than it is for an adult. And it is more difficult, as I think various members mentioned, to find adoptive parents for older children. I think Graham Pearson's example was at the extreme end, but I think there is plenty of evidence to suggest that this is a problem. The NSPCC, in their evidence, suggests that poor attachment increases the likelihood that a child or young person will have low self-esteem, find it difficult to make and sustain close relationships with their peers, be vulnerable to further abuse as they seek closeness in inappropriate relationships, and may deal with the anger by self-harm, offending behaviour, or risk-taking behaviour. So I think we're all agreed that the process needs to be speeded up. There are tensions between the rights of parents and the rights of the child. And I think Mark MacDonald made a very fair point that we can't simply be looking to fast-track this, that an early decision is necessarily the best decision, but it needs to be based on evidence and robust data. It will inevitably be on a case-by-case basis. But nevertheless, I think there is plenty more that we can do. Malcolm Chisholm pointed to some of the legal and court-based problems that exist. Resources are clearly being cited regularly as a factor, as a drag factor in all this. So Looking forward, again, I would repeat that I believe the Scottish Government have made a number of very important steps in this regard, not only through the parenting strategy, but also in terms of the Children and Young People as a rights bill, which I expect to command support across the Chamber. The Education Committee, as the convener Stuart Maxwell pointed out, has already done a fair amount of work in this area, and I think the inquiry that we're undertaking now could not be more timely. There are themes already emerging, as Stuart Maxwell identified, for ways in which we can improve this, and I think I look forward to participating in that. This, as I think the Minister acknowledged earlier on, has been an area that's frustrated the efforts of successive governments of all political hues. This will not be an easy process, but the best chance of achieving progress, I think, is if we maintain the consensus that's been much in evidence today. We have to challenge not just ministers, but those involved in the sector. But the tone in which we do that, I think, is also very, very important. It's the least that we can do in our role as corporate parents. It's the least we can do in order to support the many, many people doing such remarkable work in this area. But most of all, it's the least we can do in the interests of the looked after children and young people for which we have responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Liz Smith, to be followed by Hugh Henry. 6 minutes, please.
Deputy Presiding Officer, I think it's been very clear from the contributions in this afternoon's debate, many of which have been based on very significant and personal experience, that everybody is agreed that there is absolutely no greater responsibility than bringing up children, and no greater responsibility for the state to ensure that the children who, for one reason or another, can't be born into a secure and loving family, immediate or extended, are properly looked after. I think we're also very clear that whilst hundreds of social workers across Scotland work tirelessly to do their very best for every child in difficult circumstances, as Hanzala Malik alluded to earlier, nothing can replace the love and the security of a permanent and stable family environment. The evidence is overwhelming, whatever criteria are used, and so it goes without saying that this must be the overall policy objective. Within that policy objective, I think we have to be very clear that it is the child and his or her immediate family, or whatever definition that may be, who matters most, and that the policy making has to reflect the very diverse range of needs. If I interpret correctly all the current briefings about this and the Scottish Government's intentions for the Children and Young People's Bill properly, plus all the conclusions that have been drawn, and as yet incomplete conclusions in the Education Committee, I think it's very important to design policies which reflect that, policies which at the end of the day will be in the best interests of the child and their family or carers, but at the time when it will actually articulate with local authority structures, with schools, with healthcare and with financial pressures. Because there is a temptation, I think, to devise policy the other way round, and that's the last thing that we want to do. Because Bernardo's has made the very compelling point that this can only frustrate moves to ensure that there is a quick decision, a right decision for the child, and we note the improvements which they believe that need to be made. It has been very good indeed to celebrate National Adoption Week, to hear the updates on adoption policy from the Scottish Government, and these can help to inform members as we enter the next phase. However, I do think there are still some other expert pieces of evidence to come, and we have an obligation to listen carefully to it and weigh up the implications before we move further on some aspects of policy. As Stuart Maxwell has said, there is a need to talk to real people on the front line. The Scottish Government has acknowledged this afternoon, and so too have each of the opposition parties, that more has to be done to provide workable and equitable solutions rather than just present the statistics and diagnose the problems. How often have we been told at committee that we are very good at this part, but much less good at providing meaningful action, particularly as both, I think, Malcolm Chisholm and Liam MacArthur set out in the earliest stages. I remember last session in the committee evidence that people like Claire Burns, the Strategic Policy Manager for Celsus and the Educational Institute for Scotland, were both saying that there has been little improvement in some aspects of actually taking the desired action, but we've been very good at diagnosing the problems. In other words, there have been lots of attempts to do things, but not always have had the greatest impact.
So what lessons need to be learnt from the experts on the ground? What can we do as politicians to ensure that there are significant qualitative improvements in the life chances for adopted and looked after children? Firstly, I think there has to be some issues which relate to the decision-making process, and again I think the convener of the committee set out the challenge that we have in the wealth of evidence that has been presented to us, both written and oral, on some key themes. Because, firstly, local authorities are not yet skilled enough at being able to bring greater coherency to decision-making, and that's a point that's been made by several former councillors who are now members of this Parliament, particularly when it comes to involving council officers across lots of different departments, and it's good to hear the Scottish Government's intentions, especially with dealing with some of the discrepancies. I think the spirit of GIRFEC is very much definitely out there, but there are practicalities that still present problems, and it's been pointed out that there isn't enough sometimes of a multidisciplinary approach to training amongst some of the professionals, and that's an issue that was raised by Graham Donaldson, amongst others, when he examined how from the earliest years childminders and teachers could be assisted to provide crucial educational support for children who perhaps are going through some difficulties. I think it's also been pointed out that in terms of decision-making, it is often the financial concerns of local authorities which drive the policy rather than some of the other factors which we should be looking at for better qualitative outcomes. And I think implicit in that have been some suggestions that we need to take more seriously the role that the voluntary sector can provide in providing that additional support. It's obviously been pointed out in some areas that local communities and the local voluntary sector organisations can actually provide some of the greatest support to potential adoptive parents and to families where there is perhaps a desire to become adoptive parents, but where for one reason or another there are problems. So I think these views of the voluntary sector are crucial. Presiding Officer, if I could just sum up very quickly, there is, I think, a wealth of evidence which suggests that a lack of permanence and stability in childhood can have significantly negative impacts on younger people further into their lives. So we cannot sit back and wait and hope that things will change without a different approach of intervention in the earliest years. And I think it's been very good in the Parliament to hear that there is a will to make that happen. As Nanette Millen has said, we are very happy to support the Scottish Government's motion and both the Labour and Liberal amendments.
Many thanks.
This has been an excellent debate, and one of the things that I think that has marked it out has been the informed comments of so many members, being able to draw from their personal experiences. And it is telling when you hear not only the joy of going through the adoption process and the contribution that that can make to someone's life, but also the frustration that members have articulated and what the consequences of that frustration means. Now, we have all in this Parliament accepted the fundamental premise of Article 8 of the ECHR, which says that everyone has a right to a family life. And yet, for so many children in this country, the right to that family life is denied. And it's not only denied because they don't have a parent or a parent has been removed from their life because of a tragic event. Many children don't have a family life because of the circumstances in which they live and because of failings in their parents' lives, whether it's violence, addiction, of whatever nature. And it's quite staggering, actually, when you hear not just the extent of the problem, but the consequences. When Hanzala Malik refers to 23% of looked-after children in Scotland are in Glasgow, then you can see where the concentration of the problem lies. And then when you add on to Glasgow, the areas surrounding Glasgow, in North and South Lanarkshire, in Renfrewshire and Ayrshire, you will see that the issue of poverty and deprivation is a huge factor in causing many of these problems. And therefore, if we are fully intent in trying to come up with an adequate solution that serves so many of the children that we're talking about, then we have actually got to start making an impact on poverty and deprivation and the concentration of where it lies. Nanette Millen made an excellent contribution, and there were a number of things that she said that I thought were quite telling. I agree entirely, and I think all the speeches today have kind of echoed also what she said, that the focus must be on the child's well-being. That must be the starting point for everything that we do. But she also, I thought, made a remarkably telling point, and that she looked at the social circumstances of adoption when she adopted and the social circumstances of many children who are up for adoption now, because life is completely different. The fact that many children were placed for adoption when she was looking at it and her husband were looking at it was because of issues of illegitimacy and the social stigma that was then, compared to now, when so many children are having to be considered for adoption, not because there is any longer a social stigma, but because there is a problem in that child's life and in the lives of that child's parents, because of alcohol, because of drugs, and because of sometimes violence, not just between adults, but violence inflicted on children. And that changes significantly the whole debate about what adoption is for and why we should do it. And it's why so many members have emphasised the need for early intervention. Actually, the funny thing was that when Nanette Millen was speaking about, she spoke about early intervention in totally different circumstances, but testified to the success of that. Now we need early intervention for safety reasons for many of these children, not just to allow them to develop to their full potential. Graham Pearson mentioned, something that was equally staggering, that children in care are 13 times more likely to end up in prison. And other speakers have mentioned, some of the problems of intervention. Liam MacArthur talked about the need to have intervention because some of the problems can start at the earliest age, even before birth. And we know that there are these problems. We know that children are more likely to fail if they're growing up in these disadvantaged circumstances. And my heart goes out to those people who have made the effort to offer themselves to be adopted parents, to take on kids who have special and specific needs. Because the fact is that many of these children are damaged, not by the time that they reach 7, 8, 9 and 10. Many of these children are damaged by the time they reach 1 and 2. And what is absolutely tragic is that the mental and physical abuse of these children, even in those first year and 2 years of their lives, actually has an ongoing effect through that child's primary education development, secondary education development, and into adolescence. I don't think we fully understand the damage and the consequences and the lasting impact that kind of experience can have on a youngster, which is why I think we all need to make sure that we actually make our words today translate into action. Stuart Maxwell talked about the inconsistencies across the country. And when we talk about these things, we're not being critical for the sake of being critical or trying to score points. We're identifying these issues because we genuinely and passionately want to see a difference made for every single child in this country. And unfortunately, as Stuart Maxwell said, the shared values don't always translate into common practice and of issues like training. And let's face it, there are problems, as Stuart Maxwell has said. There are problems of resources. And unless we address those problems of resources, then we will be here next year, 5 years, and in 10 years' time talking about the same issue. So there is a challenge to this Parliament. Is this an issue that we genuinely and passionately want to make a difference on? And if it is, are we prepared to make decisions and to take the consequences of those decisions, even though it may impact on other areas of our lives and other areas of our policy priorities? Because, we should not underestimate the scale of the challenge that is there. When Margaret McDougall talked about parental neglect and substance abuse, I would bet pound to a penny that just about every one of us would be able to give examples from our casework of where that is a reality. So what can we do that would make a difference? Agencies are struggling. The voluntary sector is struggling. Social workers are struggling. It's right that today so many speakers have paid tribute to the contribution. Neil Bibby, not just from his political perspective, but from his family perspective, paying tribute to social workers. The job that social workers do is immense. They work in extremely difficult circumstances under huge pressure, but they need support. We should not wait until something goes wrong just to blame them. Let's try to do something that makes it easy for them to do their job properly. So today has been a good debate, a well-informed one, and let's see if we can do something that would make a difference. And there's just one suggestion in finishing, Presiding Officer, for the Minister to consider. No one in this debate today has disagreed. Is there not a chance for us to put our party political differences aside and to set up a ministerial-led working group involving all the parties in this Parliament, drawing in experts from outside to see whether genuinely we can do something different and something that will make a lasting difference? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now call Minister Aileen Campbell to speak until 5 o'clock, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And like so many of the other speakers have mentioned today, this afternoon's debate has provided us a timely opportunity to raise awareness of and reinforce our collective commitment to issues around looked after children and young people, in particular issues around permanence and adoption. The contributions from members have been considered and thoughtful, and most of all have highlighted that we all want the best for our looked after children. Indeed, as corporate parents ourselves, we want all of our children to experience a safe, stable, nurturing and permanent home. This is the best way to ensure that they are equipped with the confidence and self-esteem that they need to help them withstand life's challenges. It has been heartening to hear that there is also a recognition across the chamber that it doesn't matter where they live, whether their parents are single, a couple or older than those of their peers. The important thing is that our children feel loved and feel secure. As we've heard during today's debate, we cannot pretend that achieving this is an easy task. I think everyone has recognised that this is no easy thing at all to achieve. It is not without its challenges, and we can sometimes feel frustrated at the length of time it can take to find a permanent home for our children and young people. Indeed, many have cited legal issues or issues around professional capacity, but nevertheless, we understand that time it takes to find a permanent home can be frustrating. But we've also heard from, in particular, Gil Patterson in his very personal account and Mark MacDonald about how doing this too fast can have adverse effects, and we must always remember to put the child at the centre of all care, planning and decisions. But let me put on record that the Scottish Government is working very hard to improve the life chances of our looked after children. I, like everyone here, am a corporate parent, and I'm determined to focus on those things that will make the biggest difference. To support our partners across the sector, like BAF, the independent adoption agencies and every one of our local authorities, so that each child is found a permanent home as quickly as possible. I'm confident that we do have the right policies and the right approach, but we need to remain vigilant and keep these things under review. Our approach is to support those at the front lines who do the heavy lifting, and we are doing this effectively through our key initiatives such as the National Parenting Strategy, Getting It Right for Every Child, the Corporate Parenting Agenda and the Looked After Children Strategic Implementation Group Care and Permanence Plan, the National Adoption Register and, of course, the proposals we set out in the Children and Young People's Bill. These are already delivering positive change and positive differences to many children and young people's lives across Scotland. And despite there being 16,000 looked after children that we know about, certainly, often the reasons for this are that children are staying in care for longer. And there are also fewer coming into care. In addition, numbers are showing encouraging upward trends in adoption. So there is modest improvement and travelling definitely in the right direction that I think gives us all a bit of confidence that we are taking the right decisions. Turning to some of the remarks made by colleagues across this debate, I'd like to start with Neil Bibby, who made a very thoughtful and compelling speech which acknowledged the need for us all to work together to move this agenda forward in a way that always recognises that the child should be at the centre of service delivery and design. He also acknowledged the need to support our social workers and to thank them for their work. So too, I think, did Hanzala Malik and Kevin Stewart, and I absolutely agree with that. Social workers do fantastic, often unsung work, and often need to make very challenging and very difficult decisions. So it's right that we ensure social workers feel confident. We also need to recognise the need to ensure consistency in decision-making. The lack of consistency has been raised by many members contributing to the debate, including Stuart Stevenson, I've got that wrong, that's Stuart Maxwell, I apologise, and Joan McAlpine. And I recognise this, and the Scottish Government set standards that are expected from child protection services in National Child Protection Guidance, and we're currently creating a national framework for child protection learning and development to support the developmental needs of multi-agency workforce. But we do know that we always need to do more. And we also recognise the need to show leadership and to ensure that we work with local government in recognising local needs, but realising and recognising the need for national consistency. Liam MacArthur very thoughtfully and very constructively made the point about the need for earlier and better permanence planning. Indeed, I think that proved to be a theme for many people's contributions to today's debate. And I take that point very seriously, as it is absolutely crucial we get the right decisions made for every child as quickly as we can. And that is why we will continue to help local authorities to address their current caseload by providing a consultative permanence team, disseminate good practice. We've already commissioned a project to look into delays, and will continue to raise awareness of the need to get things done quickly. Related to this early permanence theme, though, was preventative spending and child development. We know that the earliest years of a child's life are the most important in terms of outcomes in later life, cognitively, emotionally and socially. Children cannot be expected to cope with multiple placements, and I certainly would not expect that of them.
One moment, Minister. There's far too much chatting in the chamber.
Is important.
Minister.
Oh, apologise. Okay, sorry. Attachment is very important, and Gil Patterson, Lee MacArthur, Jim McAlpine and Claire Adamson have all discussed this in their remarks. We've got greater understanding of this from experts the likes of Suzanne Zedick and Bruce Perry, who show us that babies are born relationship ready, that they're able to communicate before they're even born, and that their synapses are firing. Therefore, the interventions that we make and the decisions we take as policymakers are important as they last a lifetime, so they need to be positive. If attachment doesn't happen, then that child could have foundations that are not as strong as a peer who has been loved and cherished. And that's why our parenting strategy and our Play Talk Read campaign, which promotes positive interactions, more love, more cuddles, more nurture from day one of a child's life, are so important. They don't cost anything, but in terms of a child's long-term outcomes, they're absolutely priceless. Stuart Maxwell spoke very knowledgeably as convener of the Education Committee, and I'd like to put on record my thanks to him and his committee on this agenda. And I particularly welcomed the committee's work to highlight outcomes for children who are looked after at home. And I plan to host a summit specifically looking at this issue. And indeed, in light of Hugh Henry's remarks, certainly would very happily engage with him and others who have an interest on that to inform how we take that work forward, if that is something that they feel they would like to take that on. Nanette Millen, Helen Eadie, Gil Patterson, Richard Light.
Stuart Maxwell.
Sorry, I thank the Minister for taking the intervention. I was very interested in the point she made about the summit that she's due to hold, but is it possible she could give us more information on that as soon as it's available and ensure that the Education and Culture Committee is fully informed of the process that's ongoing with that particular summit, and perhaps even maybe one or two invitations to the summit?
Minister?
Yes, and of course that invite that I extended to Hugh Henry and others from different parties, of course, will be extended to Stuart Maxwell. And as we realise how we're taking that forward, of course, we'll liaise with him to ensure that he knows what work we're planning to do. As I said, Nanette Milne, Helen Easy, Gil Patterson, Richards, Lyle, Hanzala Malik all made very good contributions and powerfully used their own experiences to show how wonderful it can be to adopt a child and provide loving, nurturing homes. And I thank them for that, because I think it added a real richness to this debate. And in relation to the comments that Helen Easy made, I'd be pleased to liaise with you regarding the Romanian issues that you brought up. I can't necessarily promise tomorrow, however, I do make a commitment to speak to you about that and recognise your clear passion on that issue. Claire Adamson, Willie Coffey and George Adams all highlighted the fantastic work of Who Cares Scotland, and I've had the pleasure of meeting some of the looked after children from Who Cares and have sat in on their corporate parenting training, and can only hope that many MSPs in the Chamber do take up that offer of participating in the corporate parenting training. I also visited the debate project last week to mark National Care Leavers Week. Now, some of the testimonies that those young people told me about through their experiences through the care system are very tough to hear, and they're very tough to hear given that we have a responsibility in this chamber to create a system that has put them through that. So we absolutely need to do better by our looked after young people, and I'd encourage everyone to engage with Who Cares to get that real life perspective on our care system, one that we constantly need to improve. Many have also mentioned the real need to ensure that we've got robust data. The last LACSIG meeting that we held, I chaired, and it was clear that people in that setting also recognised the need to have much more robust data to inform how we move policy forward. So I know that LACSIG are looking very closely at this because we need that. We can't just collect data for the sake of it. We need to ensure that that data is the correct data to inform policy and to ensure that we have a system that isn't just simply becoming a pipeline for prisoners, as Gary Pearson and others mentioned in their remarks. We have lots of opportunities going forward, whether it's the bill, whether it's the National Parenting Strategy, whether it's the work of LACSIG or CELSIS. Lots of people are committed to this agenda, and I recognise and thank very, very much for everyone's contribution to this debate today in recognising National Adoption Week. And I think it's really good for the Parliament that we can send a collective message out from here that we are on the side of looked after children, and that we know as corporate parents we need to do far better by them.
That concludes the debate on permanence and adoption. We now move to the next item of business, which is decision time. There are 3 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is amendment number 4682.1 in the name of Neil Bibby, which seeks to amend motion number 4682 in the name of Aileen Campbell on permanence and adoption be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The amendment is therefore agreed to. The next question is amendment number 4682.2 in the name of Liam MacArthur, which seeks to amend motion number 4682 in the name of Aileen Campbell on permanence and adoption be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The amendment is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 4682 in the name of Aileen Campbell as amended on permanence and adoption be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is amended is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. We now move to members' business. Members who are leaving the chamber should do so quickly and quietly.